The Adventures of Three Englishmen and Three Russians in Southern Africa by Joules Verne. Part 1. Chapter 1. On the banks of the Orange River. On the 27th of January, 1854, two men lay stretched at the foot of an immense weeping willow, chatting, and at the same time watching most attentively the waters of the Orange River. This river, the Groot of the Dutch, and the Garriep of the Hottentots, may well vie with the other three great arteries of Africa, the Nile, the Niger, and the Zambezi. Like those, it has its periodical risings, its rapids and cataracts. Travellers whose names are known over part of its course, Thompson, Alexander, and Burchell, have each in their turn praised the clearness of its waters and the beauty of its shores. At this point the river, as it approached the Duke of York Mountains, offered a magnificent spectacle to the view. Insurmountable rocks, imposing masses of stone, and trunks of trees that had become mineralized by the action of the weather, deep caverns, impenetrable forests, not yet disturbed by the settler's axe, all these, shut in by a background formed by the mountains of the Garriep, made up a scene matchless in its magnificence. There, too, the waters of the river, on account of the extreme narrowness of their bed, and the sudden falling away of the soil, rushed down from a height of 400 feet. Above the fall there were only surging sheets of water, broken here and there by points of rock wreathed with green boughs. Below, there was only a dark whirlpool of tumultuous waters, crowned with a thick cloud of damp vapor and striped with all the colors of the rainbow. From this gulf there arose a deafening roar, increased and varied by the echoes of the valley. Of these two men, who had evidently been brought into this part of South Africa by the chances of an exploration, one lent only a vague attention to the beauties of nature that were open to his view. This indifferent traveller was a hunting bushman, a fine type of that brave, bright-eyed, rapidly gesticulating race of men who lead a wandering life in the woods. Bushman, a word derived from the Dutch bokjesman, is literally a man of the bushes, and is applied to the wandering tribes that scour the country in the northwest of Cape Colony. Not a family of these bushmen is sedentary. They pass their lives in roaming over the region lying between the Orange River and the mountains of the east, in pillaging farms, and in destroying the crops of the overbearing colonists, by whom they have been driven back towards the interior of the country, where more rocks than plants abound. This bushman, a man of about 40 years of age, was very tall and evidently possessed great muscular strength, for even when at rest his body presented the attitude of action. The clearness, ease, and freedom of his movement stamped him as an energetic character, a man cast in the same mold as the celebrated Leatherstocking, the hero of the Canadian prairies, though perhaps possessing less calmness than Cooper's favorite hunter, as could be seen by the transient deepening of color in his face, whenever he was animated by any unusual emotion. The bushman was no longer a savage like the rest of his race, the ancient Larquas. For, born of an English father and a Hottentot mother, the half-breed, through his association with strangers, had gained more than he had lost, and spoke the paternal tongue fluently. His costume, half Hottentot, half European, consisted of a red flannel shirt, a loose coat and breeches of antelope hide, and leggings made of the skin of a wild cat. From his neck hung a little bag containing a knife, a pipe, and some tobacco. He wore on his head a kind of skullcap of sheepskin. A belt, made from the thick thong of some wild animal, encircled his waist. And on his naked wrists were rings of ivory, wrought with remarkable skill. From his shoulders flowed across, a kind of hanging mantle, cut out of a tiger's skin, and falling as low as the knees. A dog of native breed was sleeping near him, while he himself was smoking a bone pipe in quick puffs, giving unequivocal signs of impatience. "Come, let's be calm, Mokoum," said his interlocutor. "You are truly the most impatient of mortals whenever you are not hunting, but do understand, my worthy companion, that we can't change what is. Those whom we are expecting will come sooner or later, tomorrow, if not today." The bushman's companion was a young man, from 25 to 26 years of age, and quite a contrast to him. His calm temperament was shown in every action, and it could be decided without a moment's hesitation that he was an Englishman. His much too homely costume proved him to be unaccustomed to traveling. He gave one the idea of a clerk who had wandered into a savage country, and one looked involuntarily to see if he carried a pen behind his ear, like a cashier, clerk, accountant, or some other variety of the great family of the bureaucracy. In truth, This young man was not a traveller, but a distinguished savant, William Emery, an astronomer attached to the observatory at the Cape, a useful establishment which has for a long time rendered true services to science. The scholar, rather out of his element, perhaps, in this uninhabited region of South Africa, several hundred miles from Cape Town, could hardly manage to curb the impatience of his companion. "Mr. Emery," replied the hunter in good English, "here we have been for 8 days at the place appointed on the Orange, the cataract of Morgheda. It is indeed a long time since it has befallen a member of my family to remain 8 days in one place. You forget that we are rovers, and that our feet burn at lingering here." "My friend Mokoum," replied the astronomer, "those we are waiting for are coming from England, and surely we can allow them 8 days of grace. We must take into account the length of the passage, and the hindrances which a steam vessel must meet with in ascending the Orange, and, in short, the 1,000 difficulties belonging to such an undertaking. We have been told to make every preparation for a journey of exploration in South Africa, and that being done, to come here to the Falls of Morgheda and wait for my colleague, Colonel Everest, of the Cambridge Observatory. Well, here are the Falls of Morgheda, we are at the place appointed, and we are waiting. What more do you want, my worthy bushman?" The hunter doubtless did want more, for his fingers played feverishly with the lock of his rifle, an excellent manton, a weapon of precision with conical shot, and which could bring down a wild cat or an antelope at a distance of 800 or 900 yards. Thus it may be seen that the bushman had put aside the quiver of aloes and the poisoned darts of his fellow countrymen for the use of European weapons. "But are you not mistaken, Mr. Emery?" replied Mokoum. "Is it really at the Falls of Morgheda, and towards the end of this month of January, that they have appointed to meet you?" "Yes, my friend," quietly answered William Emery, "and here is the letter from Mr. Airy, the director of the Greenwich Observatory, which will show you that I am not mistaken." The bushman took the letter that his companion gave him. He turned it over and over like a man not very familiar with the mysteries of penmanship, then giving it back to William Emery, he said, "Tell me again what the blotted piece of paper says." The young astronomer, endowed with a patience proof against everything, began again, for the 20th time, the story he had so often told to his friend the hunter. At the end of the foregoing year, William Emery had received a letter telling him of the approaching arrival of Colonel Everest and an international scientific commission in southern Africa. What the plans of the commission were, and why it came to the extremity of the continent of Africa, Emery could not say, Mr. Airy's letter being silent on that point, but following the instructions that he had received, he hastened to Lataku, one of the most northern stations in the Hottentot country, to prepare wagons, provisions, and, in short, everything that could be wanted for the victualling of a Bokjesman caravan. Then, as he knew the reputation of the native hunter, Mokoum, who had accompanied Anderson in his hunting expeditions in Western Africa, and the intrepid David Livingstone on his first journey of exploration to Lake Ngami and the falls of the Zambezi, he offered him the command of this same caravan. This done, it was arranged that the bushman, who knew the country perfectly, should lead William Emery along the banks of the Orange to the Morgheda Falls, the place appointed for the scientific commission to join them. This commission was to take its passage in the British frigate Augusta, to reach the mouth of the Orange on the western coast of Africa, as high as Cape Voltas, and to ascend the river as far as the cataracts. William Emery and Mokoum had therefore brought a wagon, which they had left at the bottom of the valley, to carry the strangers and their baggage to Lataku, unless they preferred getting there by the Orange and its affluents, after they had avoided the falls of Morgheda by a land journey of some miles. This story ended, and at length really impressed on the bushman's mind, he advanced to the edge of the gulf to whose bottom the foaming river threw itself with a crash. The astronomer followed, for their projecting point commanded a view of the river, below the cataract, for a distance of several miles. For some minutes Mokoum and his companion gazed attentively at the part of the river where it resumed its tranquillity about a quarter of a mile below them, but not an object, either boat or pirogue, disturbed its course. It was then 3 o'clock. The month of January here corresponds to the July of northern countries, and the sun, almost vertical in latitude 29 degrees, heated the atmosphere till the thermometer stood at 105 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. If it had not been for the westerly breeze, which moderated the heat a little, the temperature would have been unbearable for any but a bushman. Still, the young astronomer, with his cool temperament, all bone and all nerves, did not feel it too much. The thick foliage of the trees which overhung the abyss protected him from the direct attacks of the sun's rays. Not a bird enlivened the solitude during these hot hours of the day. Not an animal left the cool shade of the bushes to trust itself along the glades. Not a sound would have been heard in this deserted region, even if the cataract had not filled the whole air with its roar. After gazing for 10 minutes, Mokoum turned to William Emery, stamping impatiently with his large foot. His penetrating eyes had discovered nothing. "Supposing your people don't come?" he asked the astronomer. "They'll come, my brave hunter," answered William Emery. "They are men of their word, and punctual, like all astronomers. Besides, what fault do you find with them? The letter says they are to arrive at the end of January. This is the 27th, and these gentlemen have still a right to 4 more days before they need to reach the Morgheda Falls." "And supposing they have not come at the end of those 4 days?" asked the bushman. "Well, then, Master Hunter, there will be a chance for us to show our patience, for we will wait for them until I have certain proof that they are not coming at all." "By our God, Ko," cried the bushman in a sonorous voice, "you are a man who would wait until the Gariep had emptied all its roaring waters into that abyss." "No, Hunter, no," replied Emery in his ever-quiet tone, "but we must let reason govern our actions. And what does reason tell us?" "This, that if Colonel Everest and his companions, wearied with a tiresome journey, in want perhaps, and lost in this lonely country, were not to find us at the place of rendezvous, we should be to blame in every way. If anything went wrong, the responsibility would rest on us. We ought, therefore, to stay at our post as long as it is our duty to do so. And besides, we want for nothing here. Our wagon is waiting for us at the bottom of the valley and gives us shelter at night. We have plenty of provisions. Nature here is magnificent and worthy of our admiration, and it is quite a new pleasure to me to spend a few days in these splendid forests on the banks of this matchless river. As for you, Mokoum, what can you want more? Game, both hairy and feathered, abounds in the forests, and your rifle keeps us supplied with venison. Hunt, my brave hunter. Kill time by killing deer and buffaloes. Go, my good bushman. I'll watch for the loiterers meanwhile, and your feet, at any rate, will run no risk of taking root." The hunter thought the astronomer's advice was good, and decided that he would go for a few hours and beat the neighboring bushes and brushwood. Lions, hyenas, and leopards would not disturb such a Nimrod as he, so well accustomed to the African forests. He whistled to his dog-top, an animal of the hyena breed from the desert of Kalahari, and a descendant of that race of which the Balabas formerly made pointers. The intelligent creature, as impatient, seemingly, as his master, bounded up, and showed by his joyous barking how much he was gratified at the bushman's intention. Soon both man and dog disappeared among the thick masses of wood which crowned the background of the cataract. William Emery, now alone, again stretched himself at the foot of the willow, and while he was waiting for the heat to send him to sleep, began to think over his actual position. Here he was, far away from any inhabited spot, on the banks of the Orange River, a river as yet but little explored. He was waiting for Europeans, fellow countrymen who had left their homes to run the risks of a distant expedition. But what was the expedition for? What scientific problem could it want to solve in the deserts of South Africa? What observation could it be trying to take in latitude 30 degrees south? That was just what Mr. Airy, the director of the Greenwich Observatory, did not tell in his letter. As for Emery himself, they asked for his cooperation as for that of a scientific man who was familiar with the climate of those southern latitudes, and as he was openly engaged in scientific labors, he was quite at the disposal of his colleagues in the United Kingdom. As the young astronomer lay musing over all these things, and asking himself 1,000 questions which he could not answer, his eyelids became heavy, and at length he slept soundly. When he awoke, the sun was already hidden behind the western hills, whose picturesque outline stood out sharply against the bright horizon. Some gnawings of hunger told him that supper time was near. It was, in fact, 6 o'clock, and just the hour for returning to the wagon at the bottom of the valley. At that very moment a report resounded from a grove of arborescent heaths, from 12 to 15 feet high, which was growing along the slope of the hills on the right. Almost immediately the bushman and Top made their appearance at the edge of the wood, the former dragging behind him the animal that he had just shot. "Come, come, Master Pavere," cried Emery, "what have you got for supper?" "A springbok, Mr. William, replied the hunter, throwing down an animal with horns curved like a lyre. It was a kind of antelope, more generally known by the name of leaping buck, and which is to be met with in every part of South Africa. It is a charming animal, with its cinnamon-coloured back and its croup covered with tufts of silky hair of a dazzling whiteness, whilst its underpart is in shades of chestnut brown. Its flesh, always excellent eating, was on this occasion to form the evening repast. The hunter and the astronomer, lifting the beast by means of a pole placed across their shoulders, now left the head of the cataract, and in half an hour reached their encampment in a narrow gorge of the valley, where the wagon, guarded by 2 Bokjesman drivers, was waiting for them. Chapter 2. Official Presentations. For the next 3 days, the 28th, 29th, and 30th of January, Mokoum and William Emery never left the place of rendezvous. While the bushman, carried away by his hunting instincts, pursued the game and deer in the wooded district lying near the cataract, the young astronomer watched the river. The sight of this grand, wild nature enchanted him and filled his soul with new emotions. Accustomed as he was to bend over his figures and catalogues day and night, hardly ever leaving the eyepiece of his telescope, watching the passage of stars across the meridian and their occupations, he delighted in the open-air life in the almost impenetrable woods which covered the slope of the hills, and on the lonely peaks that were sprinkled by the spray from the Morgheda as with a damp dust. It was joy to him to take in the poetry of these vast solitudes, and to refresh his mind, so wearied with his mathematical speculations. And so he beguiled the tediousness of his waiting, and became a new man, both in mind and body. Thus did the novelty of his situation explain his unvarying patience, which the bushman could not share in the least, so there were continually on the part of Mokoum the same recriminations, and on the part of Emery the same quiet answers, which, however, did not quiet the nervous hunter in the smallest degree. And now the 31st of January had come, the last day fixed in Eyre's letter. If the expected party did not then arrive, Emery would be in a very embarrassing position. The delay might be indefinitely prolonged. How long, then, ought he to wait? Mr. William, said the hunter, why shouldn't we go to meet these strangers? We cannot miss them. There is only one road, that by the river, and if they are coming up, as your bit of paper says they are, we are sure to meet them. That is a capital idea of yours, Mokoum, replied the astronomer. We will go on and look out below the falls. We can get back to the encampment by the side valleys in the south. But tell me, my good bushman, you know nearly the whole course of the river, do you not? Yes, sir, answered the hunter, I have ascended it twice from Cape Voltas to its juncture with the Hart on the frontier of the Transvaal Republic. And it is navigable all the way, except at the falls of Morgheda. Just so, sir, replied the bushman. But I should add that at the end of the dry season the Orange has not much water till within 5 or 6 miles of its mouth. There is then a bar, where the swell from the west breaks very violently. That doesn't matter, answered the astronomer, because at the time that our friends want to land it will be all right. There is nothing then to keep them back, so they will come. The bushman said nothing, but shouldering his gun, and whistling to top, he led the way down the narrow path which met the river again 400 feet lower. It was then 9 o'clock in the morning, and the 2 explorers, for such they might truly be called, followed the river by its left bank. Their way did not offer the smooth and easy surface of an embankment or towing path, for the river banks were covered with brushwood, and quite hidden in a bower of every variety of plants. And the festoons of the Cynorchum filiform, mentioned by Burchell, hanging from tree to tree, formed quite a network of verdure in their path. The bushman's knife, however, did not long remain inactive, and he cut down the obstructive branches without mercy. William Emery drank in the fragrant air, here especially impregnated with the camphor-like odour of the countless blooms of the diosma. Happily there were sometimes more open places along the bank devoid of vegetation, where the river flowed quietly, and abounded in fish, and these enabled the hunter and his companion to make better progress westward, so that by 11 o'clock they had gone about for miles. The wind being in the west, the roar of the cataract could not be heard at that distance, but on the other hand, all sounds below the falls were very distinct. William Emery and the hunter, as they stood, could see straight down the river for 3 or 4 miles. Chalk cliffs, 200 feet high, overhung and shut in its bed on either side. Let us stop and rest here, said the astronomer. I haven't your hunter's legs, Mokoum, and am more used to the starry paths of the heavens than to those on terra firma. So let us have a rest. We can see 3 or 4 miles down the river from here, and if the steamer should turn that last bend we are sure to see it." The young astronomer seated himself against a giant euphorbia, 40 feet high, and in that position looked down the river, while the hunter, little used to sitting, continued to walk along the bank, and top roused up clouds of wild birds, to which, however, his master gave no heed. They had been here about half an hour, when William Emery noticed that Mokoum, who was standing about 100 feet below him, gave signs of a closer attention. Was it likely that he had seen the long-expected boat? The astronomer, leaving his mossy couch, started for the spot where the hunter stood, and came up to him in a very few moments. "Do you see anything, Mokoum?" he asked. "I see nothing, Mr. William," answered the bushman, "but it seems to me that there is an unusual murmur down the river, different to the natural sounds that are so familiar to my ears." And then, telling his companion to be quiet, he lay down with his ear on the ground, and listened attentively. In a few minutes he got up, and shaking his head, said, "I was mistaken. The noise I thought I heard was nothing but the breeze among the leaves or the murmur of the water over the stones at the edge, and yet the hunter listened again, but again heard nothing." "Mokoum," then said Mr. William Emery, "if the noise you thought you heard is caused by the machinery of a steamboat, you would hear better by stooping to the level of the river. Water always conducts sound more clearly and quickly than air." "You are right, Mr. William," answered Mokoum, "for more than once I have found out the passage of a hippopotamus across the river in that way." The bushman went nimbly down the bank, clinging to the creepers and tufts of grass on his way. When he got to the level of the river, he went into his knees, and stooping down, laid his ear close to the water. "Yes," he exclaimed, "in a few minutes, I was not mistaken, there is a sound, some miles down, as if the waters were being violently beaten. It is a continual monotonous splashing which is introduced into the current." "Is it like a screw?" asked the astronomer. "Perhaps it is, Mr. Emery, they are not far off." William Emery did not hesitate to believe his companion's assertion, for he knew that the hunter was endowed with great delicacy of sense, whether he used his eyes, nose, or ears. Mokoum climbed up the bank again, and they determined to wait in that place, as they could easily see down the river from there. Half an hour passed, which to Emery, in spite of his calmness, appeared interminable. Ever so many times he fancied he saw the dim outline of a boat gliding along the water, but he was always mistaken. At last an exclamation from the bushman made his heart leap. "Smoke!" cried Mokoum. Looking in the direction indicated by the bushman, Emery could just see a light streak rolling round the bend of the river. There was no longer any doubt. The vessel advanced rapidly, and he could soon make out the funnel pouring forth a torrent of black smoke mingling with white steam. They had evidently made up their fires to increase their speed, so as to reach the appointed place on the exact day. The vessel was still about 7 miles from the falls of Morgheda. It was then 12 o'clock, and as it was not a good place for landing, the astronomer determined to return to the foot of the cataract. He told his plan to the hunter, who only answered by turning back along the path he had just cleared along the left bank of the stream. Emery followed, and, turning round for the last time at a bend in the river, saw the British flag floating from the stern of the vessel. The return to the falls was soon effected, and in an hour's time the bushman and the astronomer halted a quarter of a mile below the cataract. For there the shore, hollowed into a semicircle, formed a little creek, and as the water was deep right up to the bank, the steamboat could easily land its passengers. The vessel could not be far off now, and it had certainly gained on the 2 pedestrians, although they had walked so fast. It was not yet in sight, for the lofty trees which hung quite over the river banks into the water, and the slope of the banks themselves, did not allow of an extensive view. But although they could not hear the sound made by the steam, the shrill whistle of the machinery broke in distinctly on the monotonous roar of the cataract, and as this whistling continued, it was evident that it was a signal from the boat to announce its arrival near the falls. The hunter replied by letting off his gun, the report being repeated with a crash by the echoes of the shore. At last the vessel was in sight, and William Emery and his companion were seen by those on board. At a sign from the astronomer the vessel turned, and glided quietly alongside the bank. A rope was thrown ashore, which the bushman seized and twisted round the broken stump of a tree, and immediately a tall man sprang lightly onto the bank and went towards the astronomer, whilst his companions landed in their turn. William Emery also advanced to meet the stranger, saying inquiringly, "Colonel Everest?" "Mr. William Emery," answered the colonel. The astronomer bowed and shook hands. "Gentlemen," then said Colonel Everest, "let me introduce you to Mr. William Emery of the Cape Town Observatory, who has kindly come as far as the Morgheda Falls to meet us." 4 of the passengers who stood near Colonel Everest bowed to the young astronomer, who did the same, and then the colonel, with his British self-possession, introduced them officially, saying, "Mr. Emery, Sir John Murray, of the county of Devon, your fellow countryman. Mr. Matthew Strux, of the Pulkowa Observatory. Mr. Nicholas Palander, of the Helsingfors Observatory, and Mr. Michael Zorn, of the Kew Observatory, 3 scientific gentlemen who represent the Russian government in our international commission." Chapter 3. The Land Journey. These introductions over, William Emery put himself at the disposal of the new arrivals, for in his position of astronomer at the Cape, he was inferior in rank to Colonel Everest, a delegate of the English government, and, with Matthew Strux, joint president of the commission. He knew, as well, that he was a distinguished man of science, famous for his reductions of the nebulae and his calculations of the occupations of the stars. He was a cold, methodical man of about 50 years of age, every hour of his life being portioned out with mathematical accuracy. Nothing unforeseen ever happened to him, and his punctuality in everything was like that of the stars in passing the meridian, and it might be said that all his doings were regulated by the chronometer. William Emery knew all this, and had therefore never doubted that the commission would arrive on the appointed day. During this time he was waiting for the colonel to tell him the object of this mission to South Africa, but as he was still silent on the point, Emery thought it better not to ask any questions, as very likely the hour fixed in the colonel's mind for the subject had not yet come. Emery also knew by repute the wealthy Sir John Murray, who, almost a rival to Sir James Ross and Lord Elgin, was, although without office, an honour to England by his scientific labours. His pecuniary sacrifices to science were likewise considerable, for he had devoted £20,000 to the establishment of a giant reflector, a match for the telescope at Parson Town, by whose means the elements of a number of double stars had just been determined. He was a man of about 40 years of age, with an aristocratic bearing, but whose character it was impossible to discover through his imperturbable exterior. As to the 3 Russians, Strux, Palander, and Zorn, their names were also well known to William Emery, although he was not personally acquainted with them. Nicholas Palander and Michael Zorn paid a certain amount of deference to Matthew Strux, as was due to his position, if it had not been to his merit. The only remark that Emery made was that they were in equal numbers, 3 English and 3 Russians, and the crew of the Queen and Char, for that was the name of the steamboat, consisted of 10 men, 5 English and 5 Russians. "Mr. Emery," said Colonel Everest, when the introductions were over, "we are now as well acquainted as if we had travelled together from London to Cape Voltas. Besides, your labours have already earned you a just renown, and on that account I hold you in high esteem. It was at my request that the English government appointed you to assist in our operations in South Africa." William Emery bowed in acknowledgment, and thought that he was now going to hear the object of the scientific commission to the Southern Hemisphere, but still Colonel Everest did not explain it. "Mr. Emery," he went on, "are your preparations complete?" "Quite, Colonel," replied the astronomer. "According to the directions in Mr. Eyre's letter, I left Cape Town a month ago, and went to the station at Lataku, and there I collected all the materials for an expedition into the interior of Africa, provisions, wagons, horses, and bushmen. There is an escort of 100 armed men waiting for you at Lataku, and they will be under the command of a clever and celebrated hunter, whom I now beg to present to you, the bushman Mokoum." "The bushman Mokoum," cried the colonel, if his usual cold tone could justify such a verb, "the bushman Mokoum. I know his name perfectly well." "It is the name of a clever, brave African," added Sir John Murray, turning to the hunter, who was not at all discomposed by the grand airs of the Europeans. "The hunter Mokoum," said William Emery, as he introduced his companion. "Your name is well known in the United Kingdom, bushman," replied Colonel Everest. "You were the friend of Anderson and the guide of David Livingstone, whose friend I have the honour of being." I thank you in the name of England, and I congratulate Mr. Emery on having chosen you as the chief of our caravan. Such a hunter as you must be a connoisseur of firearms, and as we have a very fair supply, I shall beg you to take your choice of the one which will suit you the best. We know that it will be in good hands." A smile of satisfaction played round the bushman's lips, for although he was no doubt gratified by the recognition of his services in England, yet the Colonel's offer touched him the most. He then returned thanks in polite terms, and stepped aside, while Emery and the Europeans continued their conversation. The young astronomer went through all the details of the expedition he had prepared, and the Colonel seemed delighted. He was anxious to reach Lattakoo as quickly as possible, as the caravan ought to start at the beginning of March, after the rainy season. "Will you be kind enough to decide how you will get to the town, Colonel Everest?" said William Emery. "By the Orange River, and one of its affluents, the Kuruman, which flows close to Lattakoo." "True," replied the astronomer, "but however well your vessel may travel, it cannot possibly ascend the cataract of Morgheda." "We will go round the cataract, Mr. Emery," replied the Colonel, "and by making a land journey of a few miles, we can re-embark above the falls, and from there to Lattakoo. If I am not mistaken, the rivers are navigable for a vessel that does not draw much water." "No doubt, Colonel," answered William Emery, "but this steamboat is too heavy." "Mr. Emery," interrupted the Colonel, "this vessel is a masterpiece from Leeward and Company's manufactory in Liverpool. It takes to pieces, and is put together again with the greatest ease, a key and a few bolts being all that is required by men used to the work." "You brought a wagon to the falls, did you not?" "Yes, Colonel," answered Emery, "our encampment is not a mile away." "Well, I must beg the bushman to have the wagon brought to the landing place, and it will then be loaded with the portions of the vessel and its machinery, which also takes to pieces, and we shall then get up to the spot where the Orange becomes navigable." Colonel Everest's orders were obeyed. The bushman disappeared quickly in the underwood, promising to be back in less than an hour, and while he was gone, the steamboat was rapidly unloaded. The cargo was not very considerable. It consisted of some cases of philosophical instruments, a fair collection of guns of Purdy Moore's manufacture of Edinburgh, some kegs of brandy, some canisters of preserved meat, cases of ammunition, portmanteaus reduced to the smallest size, tent cloths and all their utensils, looking as if they had come out of a travelling bazaar, a carefully packed gutta-percha canoe, which took up no more room than a well-folded counterpane, some materials for encamping, and lastly, a fan-shaped mitrailleuse, a machine not then brought to perfection, but formidable enough to terrify any enemy who might come across their path. All these were placed on the bank, and the engine, of 8 horsepower, was divided into 3 parts, the boiler and its tubes. The mechanism, which was parted from the boiler by a turn of a key, and the screw attached to the false stern post. When these had been successively carried away, the inside of the vessel was left free. Besides the space reserved for the machinery and the stores, it was divided into a fore-cabin for the use of the crew, and an aft cabin, occupied by Colonel Everest and his companions. In the twinkling of an eye the partitions vanished, all the chests and bedsteads were lifted out, and now the vessel was reduced to a mere shell, 35 feet long, and composed of 3 parts, like the Mar-Robert, the steam vessel used by Dr. Livingstone in his first voyage up the Zambesi. It was made of galvanized steel, so that it was light, and at the same time resisting. The bolts, which fastened the plates over a framework of the same metal, kept them firm, and also prevented the possibility of a leakage. William Emery was truly astounded at the simplicity of the work and the rapidity with which it was executed. The wagon, under the guidance of Mokoum and the 2 Bokjesmen, had only arrived an hour when they were ready to load it. This wagon, rather a primitive vehicle, was mounted on 4 massive wheels, each couple being about 20 feet apart. It was a regular American car in length. This clumsy machine, with its creaking axles projecting a good foot beyond the wheels, was drawn by 6 tame buffaloes, 2 and 2, who were extremely sensitive to the long goad carried by their driver. It required nothing less than such beasts as these to move the vehicle when heavily laden, for in spite of the adroitness of the leader, it stuck in the mire more than once. The crew of the Queen and Char now proceeded to load the wagon so as to balance it well everywhere. The dexterity of sailors is proverbial, and the lading of the vehicle was like play to the brave men. They laid the larger pieces of the boat on the strongest part of the wagon, immediately over the axles of the wheels, so that the cases, chests, barrels, and the lighter and more fragile packages easily found room between them. As to the travelers themselves, a 4 miles walk was nothing to them. By 3 o'clock the loading was finished, and Colonel Everest gave the signal for starting. He and his companions, with William Emery as guide, took the lead, while the bushmen, the crew, and the drivers of the wagon followed more slowly. They performed the journey without fatigue, for the slopes that led to the upper course of the Orange made their road easy by making it longer, and this was a happy thing for the heavily laden wagon, as it would thus reach its goal more surely, if more slowly. The different members of the commission clambered lightly up the side of the hill, and the conversation became general, but there was still no mention of the object of the expedition. The Europeans were admiring the splendid scenes that were open to their view, for this grand nature, so beautiful in its wildness, charmed them as it had charmed the young astronomer, and their voyage had not yet surfeited them with the natural beauties of this African region, though they admired everything with a quiet admiration, and, English-like, would not do anything that might seem improper. However, the cataract drew forth some graceful applause, and although they clapped perhaps with only the tips of their fingers, yet it was enough to show that nil admirari was not quite their motto. Besides, William Emery thought it his duty to do the honors of South Africa to his guests. For he was at home, and like certain over-enthusiastic citizens, he did not spare a detail of his African park. Towards 4:30, for they had passed the cataract of Morgheda, and being now on level ground, the upper part of the river lay before them as far as their eye could reach, and they encamped on the bank to await the arrival of the wagon. It appeared at the top of the hill about 5 o'clock, having accomplished the journey in safety, and Colonel Everest ordered it to be unloaded immediately, announcing that they were to start at daybreak the next morning. All the night was passed in different occupations. The shell of the vessel was put together again in less than an hour. Then the machinery of the screw was put into its place. The metal partitions were fixed between the cabins. The storerooms were refurnished, and the different packages neatly arranged on board, and everything done so quickly that it told a great deal in favor of the crew of the Queen and Char. These Englishmen and Russians were picked men, clever and well disciplined, and thoroughly to be depended on. The next day, the 1st of February, the boat was ready to receive its passengers at daybreak. Already there was a volume of black smoke pouring from the funnel, and the engineer, to put the machinery in motion, was causing jets of white steam to fly across the smoke. The machine being at high pressure, without a condenser, the steam escaped at every stroke of the piston, according to the system applied to locomotives, and as to the boiler, with its ingeniously contrived tubes, presenting a large surface to the furnace, it only required half an hour to furnish a sufficient quantity of steam. They had laid in a good stock of ebony and guaiacum, which were plentiful in the neighborhood, and they were now lighting the great fire with this valuable wood. At 6 o'clock Colonel Everest gave the signal for starting, and passengers and crew went on board the Queen and Char. The hunter, who was acquainted with the course of the river, followed, leaving the 2 Bochjesmen to take the wagon back to Latakou. Just as the vessel was slipping its cable, Colonel Everest turned to the astronomer and said, "By the by, Mr. Emery, you know why we have come here?" "I have not the least idea, Colonel." "It is very simple, Mr. Emery. We have come to measure an arc of meridian in South Africa." Chapter 4. A few words about the meter. The idea of an invariable and constant system of measurement, of which nature herself should furnish the exact value, may be said to have existed in the mind of man from the earliest ages. It was of the highest importance, however, that this measurement should be accurately determined, whatever had been the cataclysms of which our earth had been the scene, and it is certain that the ancients felt the same, though they failed in methods and appliances for carrying out the work with sufficient accuracy. The best way of obtaining a constant measurement was to connect it with the terrestrial sphere, whose circumference must be considered as invariable, and then to measure the whole or part of that circumference mathematically. The ancients had tried to do this, and Aristotle, according to some contemporary philosophers, reckoned that the stadium, or Egyptian cubit, formed the 100,000th part of the distance between the pole and the equator, and Eratosthenes in the time of the Ptolemies calculated the value of a degree along the Nile, between Sine and Alexandria, pretty correctly, but Posidonius and Ptolemy were not sufficiently accurate in the same kind of geodetic operations that they undertook. Neither were their successors. Picard, for the first time in France, began to regulate the methods that were used for measuring a degree, and in 1669, by measuring the celestial and terrestrial arcs between Paris and Amiens, found that a degree was equal to 57,060 toises, equivalent to 364,876 English feet, or about 69.1 miles. Picard's measurement was continued either way across the French territory as far as Dunkirk and Collier by Dominic Cassini and La Hire, 1683 to 1718, and it was verified in 1739, from Dunkirk to Perpignan, by Francis Cassini and Lacaille, and at length Machain carried it as far as Barcelona in Spain, but after his death, for he succumbed to the fatigue attending his operations, the measurement of the meridian in France was interrupted until it was subsequently taken up by Arago and Bayet in 1807, these two men prolonged it as far as the Balearic Isles, so that the arc now extended from Dunkirk to Formentera, being equally divided by the parallel of latitude 45 degrees north, halfway between the pole and the equator, and under these conditions it was not necessary to take the depression of the Earth into account in order to find the value of the quadrant of the meridian. This measurement gave 57,025 toises as the mean value of an arc of a degree in France. It can be seen that up to that time Frenchmen especially had undertaken to determine that delicate point, and it was likewise the French Convention that, according to Talleyrand's proposition, passed a resolution in 1790, charging the Academy of Sciences to invent an invariable system of weights and measures. Just at that time the statement signed by the illustrious names of Borda, Lagrange, Laplace, Monet, and Condorcet proposed that the unit of measure should be this meter, the 10,000,000th part of the quadrant of the meridian, and that the unit of weight should be the gram, a cubic centimeter of distilled water at the freezing point, and that the multiples and subdivisions of every measure should be formed decimally. Later, the determinations of the value of a terrestrial degree were carried on in different parts of the world, for the Earth being not spherical, but elliptic, it required much calculation to find the depression at the poles. In 1736, Maupertuis, Clairaut, Camus, Lemonnier, Althea, and the Swedish Celsius measured a northern arc in Lapland, and found the length of an arc of a degree to be 57,419 toises. In 1745, La Condamine, Buga, and Godin set sail for Peru, where they were joined by the Spanish officers Juan and Antonio Ulloa, and they then found that the Peruvian arc contained 56,737 toises. In 1752, Lacaille reported 57,037 toises as the length of the arc he had measured at the Cape of Good Hope. In 1754, Father Boskowicz and Father Lemay began a survey of the Papal States, and in the course of their operations found the arc between Rome and Rimini to be 56,973 toises. In 1762 and 1763, Beccaria reckoned the degree in Piedmont at 57,468 toises, and in 1768, the astronomers Mason and Dixon, in North America, on the confines of Maryland and Pennsylvania, found that the value of the degree in America was 56,888 toises. Since the beginning of the 19th century, numbers of other arcs have been measured in Bengal, the East Indies, Piedmont, Finland, Courland, East Prussia, Denmark, etc., but the English and Russians were less active than other nations in trying to decide this delicate point, their principal geodetic operation being that undertaken by General Roy in 1784, for the purpose of determining the difference of longitude between Paris and Greenwich. It may be concluded from all the above-mentioned measurements that the mean value of a degree is 57,000 toises, or 25 ancient French leagues, and by multiplying this mean value by the 360 degrees contained in the circumference, it is found that the Earth measures 9,000 leagues round. But as may be seen from the figures above, the measurements of the different arcs in different parts of the world do not quite agree. Nevertheless, by taking this average of 57,000 toises for the value of a degree, the value of the meter, that is to say, the 10,000,000th part of the quadrant of the meridian, may be deduced, and is found to be 0.513074 of the whole line, or 39.37079 English inches. In reality, this value is rather too small, for later calculations, taking into account the depression of the Earth at the poles, which is 1299.15 and not 1334, as was thought at first, now give nearly 10,856 meters instead of 10 million for the length of the quadrant of the meridian. The difference of 856 meters is hardly noticeable in such a long distance, but nevertheless, mathematically speaking, it cannot be said that the meter, as it is now used, represents the 10 millionth part of the quadrant of the terrestrial meridian exactly. There is an error of about 1/5000 of a line, i.e. 1/5000 of the 12th part of an inch. The meter, thus determined, was still not adopted by all the civilized nations. Belgium, Spain, Piedmont, Greece, Holland, the old Spanish colonies, the republics of the Equator, New Granada, and Costa Rica took a fancy to it immediately, but notwithstanding the evident superiority of this metrical system to every other, England had refused to use it. Perhaps if it had not been for the political disturbances which arose at the close of the 18th century, the inhabitants of the United Kingdom would have accepted the system, for when the Constituent Assembly issued its decree on the 8th of May, 1790, the members of the Royal Society in England were invited to cooperate with the French academicians. They had to decide whether the measure of the meter should be founded on the length of the pendulum that beats the sexagesimal second, or whether they should take a fraction of one of the great circles of the earth for a unit of length. But events prevented the proposed conference, and so it was not until the year 1854 that England, having long seen the advantage of the metrical system, and that scientific and commercial societies were being founded to spread the reform, resolved to adopt it. But still the English government wished to keep their resolution a secret until the new geodetic operations that they had commenced should enable them to assign a more correct value to the terrestrial degree, and they thought they had better act in concert with the Russian government, who were also hesitating about adopting the system. A commission of 3 Englishmen and 3 Russians was therefore chosen from among the most eminent members of the scientific societies, and we have seen that they were Colonel Everest, Sir John Murray, and William Emery, for England, and Matthew Strux, Nicholas Palander, and Michael Zorn, for Russia. The International Commission, having met in London, decided first of all that the measure of an arc of meridian should be taken in the southern hemisphere, and that another arc should subsequently be measured in the northern hemisphere, so that from the 2 operations they might hope to deduce an exact value which should satisfy all the conditions of the program. It now remained to choose between the different English possessions in the southern hemisphere, Cape Colony, Australia, and New Zealand. The 2 last, lying quite at the antipodes of Europe, would involve the Commission in a long voyage, and, besides, the Maoris and Australians, who were often at war with their invaders, might render the proposed operation difficult, while Cape Colony, on the contrary, offered real advantages. In the first place, it was under the same meridian as parts of European Russia, so that after measuring an arc of meridian in South Africa, they could measure a second one in the Empire of the Tsar, and still keep their operations a secret. Secondly, the voyage from England to South Africa was comparatively short, and thirdly, these English and Russian philosophers would find an excellent opportunity there of analyzing the labors of the French astronomer Lacaille, who had worked in the same place, and of proving whether he was correct in giving 57,037 toises as the measurement of a degree of meridian at the Cape of Good Hope. It was therefore decided that the geodetic operation should be commenced at the Cape, and as the 2 governments approved of the decision, large credits were opened, and 2 sets of all the instruments required in a triangulation were manufactured. The astronomer William Emery was asked to make preparations for an exploration in the interior of South Africa, and the frigate Augusta of the Royal Navy received orders to convey the members of the Commission and their suite to the mouth of the Orange River. It should here be added that besides the scientific question, there was also a question of national vainglory that excited these philosophers to join in a common labor, for, in reality, they were anxious to outdo France in her numerical calculations, and to surpass in precision the labors of her most illustrious astronomers, and that in the heart of a savage and almost unknown land. Thus the members of the Anglo-Russian Commission had resolved to sacrifice everything, even their lives, in order to obtain a result that should be favorable to science, and at the same time glorious for their country. And this is how it came to pass that the astronomer William Emery found himself at the Morgheda Falls, on the banks of the Orange River, at the end of January 1854. Chapter 5. A Hottentot Village. The voyage along the upper course of the river was soon accomplished, and although the weather soon became rainy, the passengers, comfortably installed in the ship's cabin, suffered no inconvenience from the torrents of rain which usually fall at that season. The Queen and Char shot along rapidly, for there were neither rapids nor shallows, and the current was not sufficiently strong to retard her progress. Every aspect of the river banks was enchanting, forest followed upon forest, and quite a world of birds dwell among the leafy branches. Here and there were groups of trees belonging to the family of the Proteaceae, and especially the wagonboom with its reddish marbled wood forming a curious contrast with its deep blue leaves and large pale yellow flowers. Then there were the zwartbeests with their black bark, and the carries with dark evergreen foliage. The banks were shaded everywhere by weeping willows, while the underwood extended beyond for several miles. Every now and then vast open tracts presented themselves unexpectedly, large plains, covered with innumerable colocynths, mingled with sugar bushes, out of which flew clouds of sweet-singing little birds, called sucafogles by the Cape colonists. The winged world offered many varieties, all of which were pointed out to Sir John Murray by the Bushmen. Sir John was a great lover of game, both hairy and feathered, and thus a sort of intimacy arose between him and Mokoum, to whom, according to Colonel Everest's promise, he had given an excellent long-range rifle, made on the Pauly system. It would be useless to attempt a description of the bushman's delight when he found himself in possession of such a splendid weapon. The two hunters understood each other well, for though so learned, Sir John Murray passed for one of the most brilliant fox hunters in Old Caledonia, and he listened to the bushman's stories with an interest amounting to envy. His eye sparkled when Mokoum showed him the wild ruminants in the woods, here a herd of 15 to 20 giraffes. There, buffaloes 6 feet high, with towering black horns, farther on, fierce gnus with horses' tails, and again, herds of camas, a large kind of deer, with bright eyes, and horns forming a threatening-looking triangle, and everywhere, in the dense forests as well as in the open plains, the innumerable varieties of antelopes which abound in southern Africa. The spurious chamois, the gemsbok, the gazelle, the dikebok, and the springbok. Was not all this something to tempt a hunter, and could the fox hunts of the Scottish lowlands vie with the exploits of a Gumming, an Anderson, or a Baldwin? It must be confessed that Sir John Murray's companions were less excited than himself at these magnificent specimens of wild game. William Emery was watching his colleagues attentively, and trying to discover their character under their cold exterior. Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux, men of about the same age, were equally cold, reserved, and formal. They always spoke with a measured slowness, and from morning to night it seemed as if they had never met before. That any intimacy should ever be established between two such important personages was a thing not to be hoped for. Two icebergs, placed side by side, would join in time, but two scientific men, each holding a high position, never. Nicholas Palander, a man of about 55 years of age, was one of those who have never been young, and who will never be old. The astronomer of Helsingfors, constantly absorbed in his calculations, might be a very admirably constructed machine, but still he was nothing but a machine, a kind of abacus, or universal reckoner. He was the calculator of the Anglo-Russian Commission, and one of those prodigies who work out multiplications to 5 figures in their head, like a 50-year-old Mondo. Michael Zorn more nearly resembled William Emery in age, enthusiasm, and good humor. His amiable qualities did not prevent his being an astronomer of great merit, having attained an early celebrity. The discoveries made by him at the Kew Observatory concerning the nebula of Andromeda had attracted attention in scientific Europe, and yet with this undoubted merit he had a great deal of modesty, and was always in the background. William Emery and Michael Zorn were becoming great friends, united by the same tastes and aspirations, and most generally they were talking together, while Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux were coldly watching each other, and Palander was mentally extracting cube roots without noticing the lovely scenes on the banks, and Sir John Murray and the Bushmen were forming plans for hunting down whole hecatombs of victims. No incident marked the voyage along the upper course of the Orange. Sometimes the granite cliffs which shut in the winding bed of the river seemed to forbid further progress, and often the wooded islands which dotted the current seemed to render the route uncertain, but the Bushmen never hesitated, and the Queen and Char always chose the right route, and passed round the cliffs without hindrance. The helmsman never had to repent of having followed Mokoum's directions. In 4 days the steamboat had passed over the 240 miles between the cataract of Morgheda and the Kuruman, an affluent which flowed exactly past the town of Latakou, whither Colonel Everest's expedition was bound. About 30 leagues above the falls the river bends from its general direction, which is east and west, and flows southeast as far as the acute angle which the territory of Cape Colony makes in the north, and then turning to the northeast, it loses itself in the wooded country of the Transvaal Republic. It was early in the morning of the 5th of February, in a driving rain, that the Queen and Char arrived at Clawater, a Hottentot village, close to the meeting of the Orange and Kuruman. Colonel Everest, unwilling to lose a moment, passed quickly by the few Bochjesman cabins that form the village, and under the pressure of her screw, the vessel began to ascend the affluent. The rapid current was to be attributed, as the passengers remarked, to a peculiarity in the river, for the Kuruman being wide at its source, was lessened as it descended by the influence of the sun's rays, but at this season, swollen by the rains, and further increased by the waters of a sub-affluent, the Moscona, it became very deep and rapid. The fires were therefore made up, and the vessel ascended the Kuruman at the rate of 3 miles an hour. During the voyage the Bushmen pointed out a good many hippopotami in the water, but these great pachyderms, clumsy, thick-set beasts, from 8 to 10 feet long, which the Dutch at the Cape call sea cows, were by no means of an aggressive nature, and the hissing of the steam and the panting of the screw quite frightened them, the boat appearing to them like some great monster which they ought to distrust, and in fact, the arsenal on board would have rendered approach very difficult. Sir John Murray would have very much liked to try his explosive bullets on the fleshy masses, but the Bushmen assured him that there would be no lack of hippopotami in the more northerly rivers, so he determined to wait for a more favourable opportunity. The 150 miles which separated the mouth of the Kuruman from the station of Lattakoo were traversed in 50 hours, and on the 7th of February the travellers had reached the end of their journey. As soon as the steamboat was moored to the bank which served as a quay, a man of 50 years of age, with a grave air but kind countenance, stepped on board, and offered his hand to William Emery. The astronomer introduced the newcomer to his travelling companions as the Reverend Thomas Dale, of the London Missionary Society, governor of the station of Lattakoo. The Europeans bowed to Mr. Dale, who gave them welcome, and put himself at their service. The town of Lattakoo, or rather the village of that name, is the most northerly of the Cape missionary stations, and is divided into old and new. The first, which the Queen and Char now reached, had 12,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the century, but they have since emigrated to the northeast, and the town, now fallen into decay, has been replaced by New Lattakoo, which is built close by, on a plain which was formerly covered with acacias, and thither Mr. Dale conducted the Europeans. It consisted of about 40 groups of houses, and contained 5,000 or 6,000 inhabitants of the tribe of the Bechuanas. Dr. Livingstone stayed in this town for 3 months before his first voyage up the Zambezi in 1840, previously to crossing the whole of Central Africa, from the Bay of Loanda to the port of Kilmarnock on the coast of Mozambique. When they reached New Lattakoo, Colonel Everest presented a letter from Dr. Livingstone, which commended the Anglo-Russian Commission to his friends in South Africa. Mr. Dale read it with much pleasure and returned it to the colonel, saying that he might find it useful on his journey, as the name of David Livingstone was known and honoured throughout that part of Africa. The members of the commission were lodged in the missionary establishment, a large house built on an eminence and surrounded by an impenetrable hedge like a fortification. The Europeans could be more comfortably lodged here than with the Bechuanas. Not that their dwellings were not kept properly in order, on the contrary, the smooth clay floors did not show a particle of dust, and the long thatched roofs were quite rain-proof, but at best, their houses were little better than huts with a round hole for a door, hardly large enough to admit a man. Moreover, they all lived in common, and close contact with the Bechuanas would scarcely have been agreeable. The chief of the tribe, one Malibahan, lived at Lattakoo, and thought it right to come and pay his respects to the Europeans. He was rather a fine man, without the thick lips and flat nose of the Negro, with a round face not so shrunken in its lower part as that of the other Hottentots. He was dressed in a cloak of skins, sewn together with considerable art, and an apron called a poojoke. He wore a leather skullcap, and sandals of oxhide. Ivory rings were wound round his arms, and from his ears hung brass plates about 4 inches long, a kind of earring, which is also a charm. An antelope's tail stood up in his skullcap, and his hunting stick was surmounted by a tuft of small black ostrich feathers. The natural colour of his body was quite invisible through the thick coating of ochre with which he was besmeared from head to foot, while some ineffaceable incisions in his legs denoted the number of enemies he had slain. The chief, as grave as Matthew Strux himself, stepped up to the Europeans, and took them in turn by the nose. The Russians permitted this to be done quite gravely, the English rather more reluctantly, but still it had to be done, for according to African custom, it denoted a solemn engagement to fulfill the duties of hospitality to the Europeans. When the ceremony was over, Malibahan retired without having uttered a word. "And now that we are naturalized Bechuanas," said Colonel Everest, "let us begin our operations without losing a day or an hour." And indeed no time was lost. Still, such is the variety of detail required in the organization of an expedition of this character, the commission was not ready to start until the beginning of March. That, however, was the time appointed by Colonel Everest, because then the rainy season just being over, the water, preserved in the fissures of the earth, would furnish a valuable resource to travelers in the desert. On the 2nd of March, then, the whole caravan, under Mokoum's command, was ready. The Europeans took farewell of the missionaries at Latakou and left the village at 7 o'clock in the morning. "Where are we going, Colonel?" asked William Emery, as the caravan passed the last house in the town. "Straight on, Mr. Emery," answered the colonel, "until we reach a suitable place for establishing a base." At 8 o'clock the caravan had passed over the low shrubby hills which skirt the town, and soon the desert, with its dangers, fatigues, and risks, lay unfolded before the travelers. Chapter 6. Better Acquaintance. The escort under the Bushman's command was composed of 100 men, all Bokjesmen and industrious, good-tempered people, capable of enduring great physical fatigue. In former times, before the arrival of the missionaries, these Bokjesmen were a lying, inhospitable race, thinking of nothing but murder and pillage, and ever taking advantage of an enemy's sleep to massacre him. To a great extent the missionaries have modified these barbarous habits, but the natives are still more or less farm pillagers and cattle lifters. 10 wagons, like the vehicle which Mokoum had taken to the Morgheda Falls, formed the bulk of the expedition. 2 of these were like moving houses, fitted up as they were with a certain amount of comfort, and served as an encampment for the Europeans, so that Colonel Everest and his companions were followed about by a wooden habitation with dry flooring, and well tilted with waterproof cloth, and furnished with beds and toilet furniture. Thus, on arriving at each place of encampment, the tent was always ready pitched. Of these wagons, one was appropriated to Colonel Everest and his countrymen, Sir John Murray and William Emery. The other was used by the Russians, Matthew Strux, Nicholas Palander, and Michael Zorn. 2 more, arranged in the same way, belonged, one to the 5 Englishmen and the other to the 5 Russians who composed the crew of the Queen and Char. The hull and machinery of the steamboat, taken to pieces and laid on one of the wagons, followed the travelers, in case the commission might come across some of the numerous lakes which are found in the interior of the continent. The remaining wagons carried the tools, provisions, baggage, arms, and ammunition, as well as the instruments required for the proposed triangular survey. The provisions of the Bokjesmen consisted principally of antelope, buffalo, or elephant meat, preserved in long strips, being dried in the sun or by a slow fire, thus economizing the use of salt, here very scarce. In the place of bread, the Bokjesmen depended on the earth nuts of the arachis, the bulbs of various species of mesembryanthemums, and other native productions. Animal food would be provided by the hunters of the party, who, adroitly employing their bows and lances, would scour the plains and revictual the caravan. 6 native oxen, long-legged, high-shouldered, and with great horns, were attached to each wagon with harness of buffalo hide. Thus the primitive vehicles moved slowly though surely on their massive wheels, ready alike for heights or valleys. For the travelers to ride there were provided small black or grey Spanish horses, good-tempered, brave animals, imported from South America, and much esteemed at the Cape. Among the troops of quadrupeds were also half a dozen tame quaggers, a kind of ass with plump bodies and slender legs, who make a noise like the barking of a dog. They were to be used in the smaller expeditions necessary to the geodetic operations, and were adapted to carry the instruments where the wagons could not venture. The only exception to the others was the bushman, who rode a splendid zebra with remarkable grace and dexterity. This animal, the beauty of whose coat with its brown stripes especially excited the admiration of the connoisseur Sir John Murray, was naturally defiant and suspicious, and would not have borne any other rider than Mokoum, who had broken it in for his own use. Some dogs of a half-savage breed, sometimes wrongly called hyena hunters, ran by the side of the wagons, their shape and long ears reminding one of the European brachhound. Such was the caravan which was about to bury itself in the deserts. The oxen advanced calmly under the guidance of their drivers, ever and again pricking them in the flank with their jam-box, and it was strange to see the troop winding along the hills in marching order. After leaving Lattakoo, whither was the expedition going? Colonel Everest had said, straight on, and indeed he and Matthew Strux could not yet follow a fixed course. What they wanted, before commencing their trigonometrical operations, was a vast level plain, on which to establish the base of the first of the triangles, which, like a network, were to cover for several degrees the southern part of Africa. The colonel explained to the bushman what he wanted, and with the calmness of one to whom scientific language is familiar, talked to him of triangles, adjacent angles, bases, meridians, zenith distances, and the like. Mokoum let him go on for a few moments, then interrupted him with an impatient movement, saying, "Colonel, I don't know anything about your angles, bases, and meridians. I don't understand even in the least what you are going to do in the desert, but that is your business. You are asking for a large level plain. Oh well, I can find you that." And at his orders, the caravan, having just ascended the Lattakoo hills, turned down again towards the southwest. This took them rather more to the south of the village, towards the plain watered by the Kuruman, and here the bushman expected to find a suitable place for the colonel's plans. From that day, he always took the head of the caravan. Sir John Murray, well mounted, never left him, and from time to time the report of a gun made his colleagues aware that he was making acquaintance with the African game. The colonel, quite absorbed in contemplating the difficulties of the expedition, let his horse carry him on. Matthew Strux, sometimes on horseback, sometimes in the wagon, according to the nature of the ground, seldom opened his lips. Nicholas Palander, as bad a rider as could be, was generally on foot. At other times he shut himself up in his vehicle, and there lost himself in the profoundest mathematical abstractions. Although William Emery and Michael Zorn occupied separate wagons at night, they were always together when the caravan was on the march. Every day and every incident of the journey bound them in a closer friendship. From one stage to another they rode, talked, and argued together. Sometimes they fell behind the train, and sometimes rode on several miles ahead of it, when the plain extended as far as they could see. They were free here and lost amidst the wildness of nature. How they forgot figures and problems, calculations and observations, and chatted of everything but science. They were no longer astronomers contemplating the starry firmament, but were more like two youths escaped from school, reveling in the dense forests and boundless plains. They laughed like ordinary mortals. Both of them had excellent dispositions, open, amiable, and devoted, forming a strange contrast to Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux, who were formal, not to say stiff. These two chiefs were often the subject of their conversation, and Emery learnt a good deal about them from his friend. "Yes," said Michael Zorn, that day, "I watched them well on board the Augusta, and I profess I think they are jealous of each other. And if Colonel Everest appears to be at the head of things, Matthew Strux is not less than his equal. The Russian government has clearly established his position. One chief is as imperious as the other, and besides, I tell you again, there is the worst of all jealousy between them, the jealousy of the learned." "And that for which there is the least occasion," answered Emery, "because in discoveries everything has its value, and each one derives equal benefit. But, my dear Zorn, if, as I believe, your observations are correct, it is unfortunate for our expedition. In such a work there ought to be a perfect understanding." "No doubt," replied Zorn, "and I fear that that understanding does not exist. Think of our confusion if every detail, the choice of a base, the method of calculating, the position of the stations, the verification of the figures, opens a fresh discussion every time. Unless I am much mistaken, I forebode a vast deal of quibbling when we come to compare our registers, and the observations we shall have made to the minutest fraction." "You frighten me," said Emery. "It would be sorrowful to carry an enterprise of this kind so far, and then to fail for want of concord. Let us hope that your fears may not be realized." "I hope they may not," answered the young Russian, "but I say again, I assisted at certain scientific discussions on the voyage, which showed me that both Colonel Everest and his rival are undeniably obstinate, and that at heart there is a miserable jealousy between them. But these two gentlemen are never apart," observed Emery. "You never find one without the other, they are as inseparable as ourselves." "True," replied Zorn, "they are never apart all day long, but then they never exchange 10 words, they only keep watch on each other. If one doesn't manage to annihilate the other, we shall indeed work under deplorable conditions. And for yourself, asked William, hesitatingly, which of the two would you wish? My dear William, replied Zorn with much frankness, I shall loyally accept him as chief who can command respect as such. This is a question of science, and I have no prejudice in the matter. Matthew Strux and the Colonel are both remarkable and worthy men. England and Russia should profit equally from their labors, therefore it matters little whether the work is directed by an Englishman or a Russian. Are you not of my opinion? Quite, answered Emery, therefore do not let us be distracted by absurd prejudices, and let us as far as possible use our efforts for the common good. Perhaps it will be possible to ward off the blows of the two adversaries, and besides there is your fellow countryman, Nicholas Palander. He, laughed Zorn, he will neither see, hear, nor comprehend anything. He would make calculations to any extent, but he is neither Russian, Prussian, English, or Chinese, he is not even an inhabitant of this sublunary sphere, he is Nicholas Palander, that's all. I cannot say the same for my countryman. Sir John Murray, said Emery. He is a thorough Englishman and a most determined hunter, and he would sooner follow the traces of an elephant and giraffe than give himself any trouble about a scientific argument. We must therefore depend upon ourselves, Zorn, to neutralize the antipathy between our chiefs. Whatever happens, we must hold together. Whatever happens, replied Zorn, holding out his hand to his friend. The bushman still continued to guide the caravan down towards the southwest. At midday, on the 4th of March, it reached the base of the long wooded hills which extend from Lattakoo. Mokoum was not mistaken, he had led the expedition towards the plain, but it was still undulated, and therefore unfitted for an attempt at triangulation. The march continued uninterrupted, and Mokoum rode at the head of the riders and wagons, while Sir John Murray, Emery, and Zorn pushed on in advance. Towards the end of the day, they all arrived at a station occupied by one of the wandering Boers, or farmers, who are induced by the richness of the pasture land to make temporary abodes in various parts of the country. The colonist, a Dutchman, and head of a large family, received the colonel and his companions most hospitably, and would take no remuneration in return. He was one of those brave, industrious men, whose slender capital, intelligently employed in the breeding of oxen, cows, and goats, soon produces a fortune. When the pasturage is exhausted, the farmer, like a patriarch of old, seeks for new springs and fertile prairies, pitching his camp afresh where the conditions seem favorable. The farmer opportunely told Colonel Everest of a wide plain, 15 miles away, which would be found quite flat. The caravan started next morning at daybreak. The only incident that broke the monotony of the long morning march was Sir John Murray's taking a shot, at a distance of more than 1,000 yards, at a curious animal about 5 feet high, with the muzzle of an ox, a long white tail, and pointed horns. It fell with a heavy groan, much to the astonishment of the bushman, who was surprised at seeing the animal struck at such a distance. The gnu generally affords a considerable quantity of excellent meat, and was accordingly in high esteem among the hunters of the caravan. The site indicated by the farmer was reached about midday. It was a boundless prairie stretching to the north without the slightest undulation. No better spot for measuring a base could be imagined, and the bushmen, after a short investigation, returned to Colonel Everest with the announcement that they had reached the place they were seeking. Chapter 7. The Base of the Triangle. The work undertaken by the Commission was a triangulation for the purpose of measuring an arc of meridian. Now the direct measurement of 1 or more degrees by means of metal rods would be impracticable. In no part of the world is there a region so vast and unbroken as to admit of so delicate an operation. Happily, there is an easier way of proceeding by dividing the region through which the meridian passes into a number of imaginary triangles, whose solution is comparatively easy. These triangles are obtained by observing signals, either natural or artificial, such as church towers, posts, or reverberatory lamps, by means of the theodolite or repeating circle. Every signal is the vertex of a triangle, whose angles are exactly determined by the instruments, so that a good observer with a proper telescope can take the bearings of any object whatever, a tower by day, or a lamp by night. Sometimes the sides of the triangles are many miles in length, and when Arago connected the coast of Valencia in Spain with the Balearic Islands, one of the sides measured 422,555 toises. When one side and two angles of any triangle are known, the other sides and angle may be found, by taking, therefore, a side of one of the known triangles for a new base, and by measuring the angles adjacent to the base, new triangles can be successively formed along the whole length of the arc, and since every straight line in the network of triangles is known, the length of the arc can be easily determined. The values of the sides and angles may be obtained by the theodolite and repeating circle, but the first side, the base of the whole system, must be actually measured on the ground, and this operation requires the utmost care. When D'Alembert and Méchain measured the meridian of France from Dunkirk to Barcelona, they took for their base a straight line, 12,150 meters in length, in the road from Melun to Lusaint, and they were no less than 42 days in measuring it. Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux designed proceeding in the same way, and it will be seen how much precision was necessary. The work was begun on the 5th of March, much to the astonishment of the Bochjesmen, who could not at all understand it. Mokoum thought it strange for these learned men to measure the earth with rods 6 feet long, but anyway, he had done his duty. They had asked him for a level plain, and he had found it for them. The place was certainly well chosen. Covered with dry, short grass, the plain was perfectly level as far as the horizon. Behind lay a line of hills forming the southern boundary of the Kalahari Desert. Towards the north the plain seemed boundless. To the east, the sides of the tableland of Latakou disappeared in gentle slopes, and in the west, where the ground was lower, the soil became marshy, as it imbibed the stagnant water which fed the affluents of the Kuruman. "I think, Colonel Everest," said Strux, after he had surveyed the grassy level, "that when our base is established, we shall be able here also to fix the extremity of our meridian." "Likely enough," replied the colonel. "We must find out, too, whether the arc meets with any obstacles that may impede the survey. Let us measure the base, and we will decide afterwards whether it will be better to join it by a series of auxiliary triangles to those which the arc must cross." They thus resolved to proceed to the measurement of the base. It would be a long operation, for they wanted to obtain even more correct results than those obtained by the French philosophers at Melun. This would be a matter of some difficulty, since when a new base was measured afterwards near Perpignan to verify the calculations, there was only an error of 11 inches in a distance of 330,000 toises. Orders were given for encamping, and a Bochjesmen village, a kind of kraal, was formed on the plain. The wagons were arranged in a circle like the houses, the English and Russian flags floating over their respective quarters. The center was common ground. The horses and buffaloes, which by day grazed outside, were driven in by night to the interior, to save them from attacks of the wild beasts around. Mokoum took upon himself to arrange the hunting expedition for revictualling, and Sir John Murray, whose presence was not indispensable in the measurement of the base, looked after the provisions, and served out the rations of preserved meat and fresh venison. Thanks to the skill and experience of Mokoum and his companions, game was never wanting. They scoured the district for miles round, and the report of their guns resounded at all hours. The survey began on the next day, Zorn and Emery being charged with the preliminaries. "Come along," said Zorn, "and good luck be with us." The primary operation consisted in tracing a line on the ground where it was especially level. This chanced to be from southeast to northwest, and pickets being placed at short intervals to mark the direction, Zorn carefully verified the correctness of their position by means of the thread wires of his telescope. For more than 8 miles, the proposed length of the base, was the measurement continued, and the young men performed their work with scrupulous fidelity. The next step was to adjust the rods for the actual measurement, apparently a very simple operation, but which, in fact, demands the most continuous caution, as the success of a triangulation in a great measure is contingent on its preciseness. On the morning of the 10th, 12 wooden pedestals were planted along the line, securely fastened in their position, and prepared to support the rods. Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux, assisted by their young coadjutors, placed the rods in position, and Nicholas Palander stood ready, pencil in hand, to write down in a double register the figures transmitted to him. The rods employed were 6 in number and exactly 2 toises in length. They were made of platinum, as being, under ordinary circumstances, unaffected by any condition of the atmosphere. In order, However, to provide against any change of temperature, each was covered with a rod of copper somewhat shorter than itself, and a microscopic vernier was attached to indicate any contraction or expansion that might occur. The rods were next placed lengthwise, with a small interval between each, in order to avoid the slight shock which might result from immediate contact. Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux with their own hands placed the first rod. About 100 toises farther on, they had marked a point of sight, and as the rods were each provided with iron projections, it was not difficult to place them exactly in the proper direction. Emery and Zorn, lying on the ground, saw that the projection stood exactly in the middle of the sight. "Now," said Colonel Everest, "we must define our exact starting point. We will drop a line from the end of our first rod, and that will definitely mark the extremity of our base." "Yes," answered Strux, "but we must take into account the radius of the line." "Of course," said the colonel. The starting point determined, the work went on. The next proceeding was to determine the inclination of the base with the horizon. "We do not, I believe, pretend," said Colonel Everest, "to place the rod in a position which is perfectly horizontal." "No," answered Strux, "it is enough to find the angle which each rod makes with the horizon, and we can then deduce the true inclination." Thus agreed, they proceeded with their observations, employing their spirit level, and testing every result by the vernier. As Palander was about to inscribe the record, Strux requested that the level should be reversed, in order that by the division of the two registers a closer approximation to truth might be attained. This mode of double observation was continued throughout the operations. Two important points were now obtained: the direction of the rod with regard to the base, and the angle which it made with the horizon. The results were inscribed in two registers, and signed by the members of the commission. There were still two further observations, no less important, to be made: the variation of the rod caused by differences of temperature, and the exact distance measured by it. The former was easily determined by comparing the difference in length between the platinum and copper rods. The microscope gave the variation of the platinum, and this was entered in the double register, to be afterwards reduced to 16 degrees centigrade. They had now to observe the distance actually measured. To obtain this result, it was necessary to place the second rod at the end of the first, leaving a small space between them. When the second rod was adjusted with the same care as the former, it only remained to measure the interval between the two. A small tongue of platinum, known as a slider, was attached to the end of the platinum bar that was not covered by the copper, and this Colonel Everest slipped gently along until it touched the next rod. The slider was marked off into 10,000 ths of a toise, and as a vernier with its microscope gave the 100,000 ths, the space could be very accurately determined. The result was immediately registered. Michael Zorn, considering that the covered platinum might be sooner affected by heat than the uncovered copper, suggested another precaution. Accordingly, they erected a small awning to protect the rod from the sun's rays. For more than a month were these minutiae patiently carried on. As soon as 4 bars were adjusted, and the requisite observations complete, the last of the rods was carried to the front. It was impossible to measure more than 220 to 230 toises a day, and sometimes, when the wind was violent, operations were altogether suspended. Every evening, about 3/4 of an hour before it became too dark to read the verniers, they left off work, after taking various anxious precautions. They brought forward temporarily the rod number 1, and marked the point of its termination. Here they made a hole, and drove in a stake with a leaden plate attached. They then replaced number 1 in its original position, after observing the inclination, the thermometric variation, and the direction. They noted the prolongation measured by rod number 4, and then, with a plumb line touching the foremost end of rod number 1, they made a mark on the leaden plate. They carefully traced through this point 2 lines at right angles, one signifying the base, the other the perpendicular. The plate was then covered with a wooden lid, the hole filled in, and the stake left buried till the morning. Thus, if any accident had happened to their apparatus during the night, they would not be obliged to begin afresh. The next day, the plate was uncovered, and rod number 1 replaced in the same position as on the evening before, by means of the plumb line, whose point ought to fall exactly on the point intersected by the 2 straight lines. These operations were carried on for 38 days along the plane, and every figure was registered doubly, and verified, compared, and approved, by each member of the commission. Few discussions arose between Colonel Everest and his Russian colleague, and if sometimes the smallest fraction of a toys gave occasion for some polite cavillings, they always yielded to the opinion of the majority. One question alone called for the intervention of Sir John Murray. This was about the length of the base. It was certain that the longer the base, the easier would be the measurement of the opposite angle. Colonel Everest proposed 6,000 toises, nearly the same as the base measured at Melun, but Matthew Strux wished that it should be 10,000 toises, since the ground permitted. Colonel Everest, however, remained firm, and Strux seemed equally determined not to yield. After a few plausible arguments, personalities began. They were no longer two astronomers, but an Englishman and a Russian. Happily the debate was interrupted by some days of bad weather, which allowed their tempers to cool. It was subsequently decided by the majority that they should split the difference and assign 8,000 toises as the measurement of the base. The work was at length completed. Any error which occurred, in spite of their extreme precision, might be afterwards corrected by measuring a new base from the northern extremity of the meridian. The base measured exactly 8,037.75 toises, and upon this they were now to place their series of triangles. Chapter 8. The 24th Meridian. The measurement of the base occupied 38 days, from the 6th of March to the 13th of April, and without loss of time the chiefs decided to begin the triangles. The first operation was to find the southern extremity of the arc, and the same being done at the northern extremity, the difference would give the number of degrees measured. On the 14th they began to find their latitude. Emery and Zorn had already on the preceding nights taken the altitude of numerous stars, and their work was so accurate that the greatest error was not more than 2 inches, and even this was probably owing to the refraction caused by the changes in the atmospheric strata. The latitude thus carefully sought was found to be 27.951789 degrees. They then found the longitude, and marked the spot on an excellent large-scale map of South Africa, which showed the most recent geographical discoveries, and also the routes of travelers and naturalists, such as Livingstone, Anderson, Magyar, Baldwin, Burchell, and Liechtenstein. They then had to choose on what meridian they would measure their arc. The longer this arc is, the less influence have the errors in the determination of latitude. The arc from Dunkirk to Formentera, on the meridian of Paris, was exactly 9 degrees and 56 minutes. They had to choose their meridian with great circumspection. Any natural obstacles, such as mountains or large tracts of water, would seriously impede their operations, but happily, this part of Africa seemed well suited to their purpose, since the risings in the ground were inconsiderable, and the few watercourses easily traversed. Only dangers, and not obstacles, need check their labors. This district is occupied by the Kalahari Desert, a vast region extending from the Orange River to Lake Ngami, from latitude 20 degrees south to latitude 29 degrees. In width, it extends from the Atlantic on the west as far as long 25 degrees east. Dr. Livingstone followed its extreme eastern boundary when he traveled as far as Lake Ngami and the Zambezi Falls. Properly speaking, it does not deserve the name of desert. It is not like the sands of Sahara, which are devoid of vegetation and almost impassable on account of their aridity. The Kalahari produces many plants. Its soil is covered with abundant grass. It contains dense groves and forests. Animals abound, wild game and beasts of prey, and it is inhabited and traversed by sedentary and wandering tribes of Bushmen and Bakalaharis. But the true obstacle to its exploration is the dearth of water which prevails through the greater part of the year, when the rivers are dried up. However, at this time, just at the end of the rainy season, they could depend upon considerable reservoirs of stagnant water, preserved in pools and rivulets. Such were the particulars given by Mokoum. He had often visited the Kalahari, sometimes on his own account as a hunter, and sometimes as a guide to some geographical exploration. It had now to be actually considered whether the meridian should be taken from one of the extremities of the base, thus avoiding a series of auxiliary triangles. After some discussion, it was decided that the southern extremity of the base would serve for a starting point. It was the 24th meridian east from Greenwich and extended over 7 degrees of latitude, from 20 degrees to 27 degrees, without any apparent natural obstacle. Towards the north it certainly crossed the eastern end of Lake Ngami, but Arago had met with greater difficulties than this when he applied his geodesy to connect the coast of Spain with the Balearic Islands. It was accordingly decided that meridian 24 degrees should be measured, since, if it were afterwards prolonged into Europe, a northern arc of the same meridian might be measured on Russian territory. The astronomers proceeded at once to choose a station which should form the vertex of the first triangle. This was a solitary tree to the right of the meridian, standing on a mound about 10 miles away. It was distinctly visible from each extremity of the base, and its slender top facilitated the taking of its bearings. The angle made by the tree with the southeast extremity of the base was first observed, with the help of one of Borda's repeating circles. The two telescopes were adjusted so that their axes were exactly in the plane of the circle, in such a way that their position represented the angular distance between the tree and the northwest extremity of the base. This admirably constructed instrument corrects nearly all the errors of observation, and indeed, if the repetitions are numerous, the errors tend to counterbalance and correct each other. The Commission had for repeating circles, 2 for measuring angles, and 2 more with vertical circles for obtaining zenith distances, and so calculating in a single night, to the smallest fraction of a second, the latitude of any station. And indeed, in this important survey, it was not only necessary to obtain the value of the angles of the triangles, but also to measure the meridian altitude of the stars, that being equal to the latitude of each station. The work began on the 14th of April. Colonel Everest, Zorn, and Palander observed the angle at the southeast extremity of the base, while Strux, Emery, and Sir John Murray observed that at the northwest extremity. Meantime the camp was raised, and the bullocks harnessed, and Mokoum conducted the caravan to the first station as a halting place. 2 caravans, with their drivers, accompanied the observers to carry the instruments. The weather was bright, but had the atmosphere been unfavorable by day, the observations would have been made by night by means of reverberators or electric lamps. On the first day, the 2 angles were measured, and the result inscribed on the double register, and the astronomers all met in the evening at the camp which had been formed round the tree which had served for their point of sight. It was an immense baobab, more than 80 feet in circumference. Its cyanide-colored bark gave it a peculiar appearance. The whole caravan found room beneath its wide branches, which were inhabited by crowds of squirrels, which greedily devoured the white pulp of its egg-shaped fruit. Supper was prepared for the Europeans by the ship's cook. There was no lack of venison, for the hunters had scoured the neighborhood, and killed some antelopes, and soon the air was filled with an odor of broiled meat, which still further aroused the appetite of the hungry savants. After the comforting repast, the astronomers retired to their respective wagons, whilst Mokoum placed sentinels round the camp. Large fires of the dead branches of the baobab burnt throughout the night, and kept at a respectful distance the tawny beasts, who were attracted by the odor of the wrecking flesh. After 2 hours' sleep, however, Emery and Zorn got up, their observations not yet finished. They must find the altitudes of some stars to determine the latitude of the station, and both, regardless of the day's fatigues, stood at their telescopes, and rigorously determined the change of zenith caused by the removal from the first station to the second, while the laugh of the hyena and the roar of the lion resounded over the somber plain. Chapter 9. The Kraal. The next day operations were continued. The angle made by the baobab with the extremities of the base was measured, and the first triangle solved. 2 more stations were chosen to the right and left of the meridian, one formed by a distinct mound, 6 miles away, the other marked out by a post about 7 miles distant. The triangulation went on uninterruptedly for a month, and by the 15th of May the observers had advanced northwards 1 degree, having formed 7 triangles. During this first series of operations, the Colonel and Strux were rarely together. The division of labor separated them, and the circumstance of their daily work being several miles apart was a guarantee against any dispute. Each evening they returned to their several abodes, and although at intervals discussions arose about the choice of stations, there was no serious altercation. Hence Zorn and his friend were in hopes that the survey would proceed without any open rupture. After advancing 1 degree from the south, the observers found themselves in the same parallel with Lataku, from which they were distant 35 miles to the west. Here a large kraal had lately been formed, and as it was a marked halting place, Sir John Murray proposed that they should stay for several days. Zorn and Emery could take advantage of the rest to take the altitude of the sun, and Palander would employ himself in reducing the measurements made at different points of sight to the uniform level of the sea. Sir John himself wanted to be free from scientific observations, that he might divert himself with his gun among the fauna of the country. A kraal, as it is termed by the natives of South Africa, is a kind of moving village, wandering from one pasturage to another. It is an enclosure composed ordinarily of about 30 habitations, and containing several hundred inhabitants. The kraal now reached was formed by a group of more than 60 huts, enclosed for protection from wild animals by a palisade of prickly aloes, and situated on the banks of a small affluent of the Kuruman. The huts, made of waterproof rush mats fastened to wooden beams, were like low hives. The doorway, protected by a skin, was so small that it could only be entered on hands and knees, and from this, the only aperture, issued such dense wreaths of smoke as would make existence in these abodes problematical to any but a Bochjesman or a Hottentot. The whole population was roused by the arrival of the caravan. The dogs, of which there was one for the protection of each cabin, barked furiously, and about 200 warriors, armed with assegais, knives, and clubs, and protected by their leathern shields, marched forward. A few words from Mokoum to one of the chiefs soon dispelled all hostile feeling, and the caravan obtained permission to encamp on the very banks of the stream. The Bochjesmen did not even refuse to share the pastures, which extended for miles away. Mokoum, having first given orders for the wagons to be placed in a circle as usual, mounted his zebra and set off in company with Sir John Murray, who rode his accustomed horse. The hunters took their dogs and rifles, showing their intention of attacking the wild beasts, and went towards the woods. "I hope, Mokoum," said Sir John, "that you are going to keep the promise you made at the Morgheda Falls, that you would bring me into the best sporting country in the world. But understand, I have not come here for hares or foxes, I can get them at home." "Before another hour," replied the bushman. "You are rather too fast. A little patience, please. For myself, I am never patient except when hunting, and then I make amends for all my impatience at other times. Don't you know, Sir John, that the chase of large beasts is quite a science? Here you must wait and watch. You must not step or even look too quickly. For my part, I have laid in wait for days together for a buffalo or gemsbok, and if I have had success at last, I have not considered my trouble in vain." "Very good," replied Sir John, "I can show you as much patience as you can wish, but mind, the halt only lasts for 3 or 4 days, and we must lose no time." "There is something in that," said the bushman, so calmly that Emery would not have recognized his companion of the Orange River. "We will just kill that which comes first. Sir John, antelope or deer, gnu or gazelle, anything must do for hunters in a hurry." "Antelope or gazelle," cried Sir John, "why, what more could I ask, my good fellow?" "As long as your honor is satisfied, I have nothing more to say," said the bushman, somewhat ironically. "I thought that you would not let me off with anything less than a rhinoceros or 2, or at least an elephant anything and anywhere," said Sir John. "We only waste time in talking." The horses were put to a hand gallop, and the hunters advanced quickly towards the forest. The plain rose with a gentle slope towards the northeast. It was dotted here and there with shrubs in full bloom, from which issued a viscous resin, transparent and odorous, of which the colonists make a balm for wounds. In picturesque groups rose the nwanas, a kind of sycamore fig, whose trunks, leafless to the height of 30 or 40 feet, supported a spreading parasol of verdure. Among the foliage chattered swarms of screaming parrots, eagerly pecking the sour figures. Farther on were mimosas with their yellow clusters, silver trees, shaking their silky tufts, and aloes with spikes so red that they might pass for coral plants torn from the depths of the sea. The ground, enameled with amaryllis with their bluish foliage, was smooth and easy for the horses, and in less than an hour after leaving the kraal, the sportsmen reached the wood. For several miles extended a forest of acacias, the entangled branches scarcely allowing a ray of sunlight to penetrate to the ground below, which was encumbered by brambles and long grass. The hunters had little difficulty, however, in urging on both horse and zebra, in spite of every obstacle, resting at the recurring glades to examine the thickets around them. The first day was not very favorable. In vain was the forest scoured. Not a single beast stirred, and Sir John's thoughts turned more than once to the plains of Scotland, where a shot is rarely long delayed. Mokoum evinced neither surprise nor vexation. To him it was not a hunt, but merely a rush across the forest. Towards 6 in the evening they had to think about returning. Sir John was more vexed than he would allow. Rather than that he, the renowned hunter, should return empty-handed, he resolved to shoot whatever first came within range, and fortune seemed to favour him. They were not more than 3 miles from the kraal when a hare, of the species called Lepus rupestris, darted from a bush about 150 paces in front of them. Sir John did not hesitate a moment, and sent his explosive ball after the poor little animal. The bushman gave a cry of indignation at such a ball being employed for such an aim, but the Englishman, eager for his prey, galloped to the spot where the victim fell. In vain! The only vestiges of the hare were the bloody morsels on the ground. Whilst the dogs rummaged in the brushwood, Sir John looked keenly about, and cried, "I am sure I hit it." "Rather too well," replied the bushman quietly. And sure enough, the hare had been blown into countless fragments. Sir John, greatly mortified, remounted his horse, and returned to camp, without uttering another word. The next day the bushman waited for Sir John Murray to propose another expedition, but the Englishman applied himself for a time to his scientific instruments. For pastime he watched the occupants of the kraal as they practiced with their bows, or played on the gora, an instrument composed of a piece of catgut stretched on a bow, and kept in vibration by blowing through an ostrich feather. He remarked that the women, while occupied in their domestic duties, smoked matakuan, that is, the unwholesome hemp plant, a practice indulged in by most of the natives. According to some travelers, this inhaling of hemp increases physical strength to the damage of mental energy, and, indeed, many of the Bokjesmen appeared stupefied from its effects. At dawn, however, the following day, Sir John Murray was aroused by the appearance of Mokoum, who said, "I think, sir, we may be fortunate enough today to find something better than a hare." Sir John, not heeding the satire, declared himself ready, and the 2 hunters, accordingly, were off betimes. This time, Sir John, instead of his formidable rifle, carried a simple gun of Goldwyn's, as being a more suitable weapon. True, there was a chance of meeting some prowling beast from the forest, but he had the hare on his mind, and would sooner use small shot against a lion than repeat an incident unprecedented in the annals of sport. Fortune, today, was more favourable to the hunters. They brought down a couple of Harris bucks, a rare kind of black antelope, very difficult to shoot. These were charming animals, for feet high, with long diverging horns shaped like scimitars. The tips of their noses were narrow, they had black hoofs, close soft hair and pointed ears. Their face and belly, white as snow, contrasted well with their black back, over which fell a wavy mane. Hunters may well be proud of such shots, for the harrisbuck has always been the desideratum of the Delagogues, Valbergs, Cummings and Baldwins, and it is one of the finest specimens of the southern fauna. But what made the Englishman's heart beat fastest was Mokoum showing him certain marks on the edge of the thick underwood, not far from a deep pool, surrounded by giant euphorbias, and whose surface was dotted with sky-blue water lilies. "Come and lie in ambush here tomorrow, sir," said Mokoum, "and this time you may bring your rifle. Look at these fresh footprints." "What are they?" "Can they be an elephant's?" asked Sir John. "Yes," replied Mokoum, "and, unless I am mistaken, of a male full-grown." Eagerly, then, was the engagement made for the following day. Sir John's horse, as they returned, carried the harrisbucks. These fine creatures, so rarely captured, excited the admiration of the whole caravan, and all congratulated Sir John, except perhaps Matthew Strux, who knew little of animals, except the great bear, the centaur, Pegasus, and other celestial fauna. At 4 o'clock the next morning, the hunters, attended by their dogs, were already hidden in the underwood. They had discovered by new footmarks that the elephants came in a troop to drink at the pool. Their grooved rifles carried explosive bullets. Silent and still, they watched for about half an hour, when they observed a movement in the grove, about 50 paces from the pool. Sir John seized his gun, but the bushman made him a sign to restrain his impatience. Soon large shadows appeared, the thickets rustled under the violence of some pressure, the brushwood snapped and crackled, and the sound of a loud breathing was perceptible through the branches. It was the herd of elephants. Half a dozen gigantic creatures, almost as large as those of India, advanced slowly towards the pool. The increasing daylight allowed Sir John, struck with admiration, to notice especially a male of enormous size. His colossal proportions appeared in the partial light even greater than they really were. While his trunk was extended above the underwood, with his curved tusks he struck the great stems, which groaned under the shock. The bushman leant down close to Sir John's ear and whispered, "Will he suit you?" Sir John made a sign of affirmation. "Then," said Mokoum, "we will separate him from the rest." At this instant, the elephants reached the edge of the pool, and their spongy feet sank into the soft mud. They pumped up the water with their trunks, and poured it into their throats with a loud gurgling. The great male looked uneasily about him, and seemed to sense some approaching danger. Suddenly the bushman gave a peculiar cry. The dogs, barking furiously, darted from concealment, and rushed towards the herd. At the same moment, Mokoum, charging his companion to remain where he was, went off on his zebra to intercept the elephant's retreat. The animal made no attempt to take flight, and Sir John, with his finger on the lock of his rifle, watched him closely. The brute beat the trees, and lashed his tail furiously, showing signs not of uneasiness, but of anger. Now, for the first time, catching sight of his enemy, he rushed upon him at once. Sir John was about 60 paces distant, and waiting till the elephant came within 40 paces, he aimed at his flank and fired. But a movement of the horse made his aim unsteady, and the ball only entered the soft flesh without meeting any obstacle sufficient to make it explode. The enraged beast increased its pace, which was rather a rapid walk than a run, and would have soon distanced the horse. Sir John's horse reared, and rushed from the thicket, his master unable to hold him in. The elephant followed, ears erect, and bellowing like a trumpet. Sir John, thus carried away, held on to his horse tightly with his knees, and endeavored to slip a cartridge into the chamber of his rifle. Still the elephant gained on him. They were soon beyond the wood, and out on the plain. Sir John vigorously used his spurs, and the two dogs rushed panting in the rear. The elephant was not 2 lengths behind. Sir John could hear the hissing of his trunk, and almost feel his strong breath. Every moment he expected to be dragged from his saddle by the living lasso. All at once the horse sunk on his hind quarters, struck by the elephant on his haunches. He neighed, and sprung to one side, thus saving Sir John. The elephant, unable to check his course, passed on, and sweeping the ground with his trunk, caught up one of the dogs, and shook it in the air with tremendous violence. No resource remained except to re-enter the wood, and the horse's instinct carried him thither. The elephant continued to give chase, brandishing the unlucky dog, whose head he smashed against a sycamore as he rushed into the forest. The horse darted into a dense thicket entangled with prickly creepers, and stopped. Sir John, torn and bleeding, but not for an instant discomposed, turned round, and shouldering his rifle, took aim at the elephant close to the shoulder, through the network of creepers. The ball exploded as it struck the bone. The animal staggered, and almost at the same moment a second shot from the edge of the wood struck his left flank. He fell on his knees near a little pool, half hidden in the grass. There, pumping up the water with his trunk, he began to wash his wounds, uttering plaintive cries. The bushman now appeared, shouting, "He is ours, he is ours." And in truth the animal was mortally wounded. He groaned piteously, and breathed hard. His tail moved feebly, and his trunk, fed from the pool of his blood, poured back a crimson stream on the surrounding brushwood. Gradually failed his strength, and the great beast was dead. Sir John Murray now emerged from the grove. He was half naked, little of his hunting costume remaining but rags. But he felt as though he could have given his very skin for this triumph. "A glorious fellow," he exclaimed, as he examined the carcass, but rather too big to carry home. "True, sir," answered Mokoum, "we will cut him up on the spot, and carry off the choice parts. Look at his magnificent tusks. 25 pounds apiece at least. An ivory at 5 shillings a pound will mount up." Thus talking, the hunter proceeded to cut up the animal. He took off the tusks with his hatchet and contented himself with the feet and trunk as choice morsels with which to regale the members of the commission. This operation took some time, and he and his companion did not get back to camp before midday. The bushman had the elephant's feet cooked according to the African method. That is, by burying them in a hole previously heated, like an oven, with hot coals. The delicacy was fully appreciated by all, not excepting the phlegmatic Palander, and Sir John Murray received a hearty round of compliments. Chapter 10. The Rapid. During their sojourn by the kraal, Colonel Everest and Matthew Strux had been absolutely strangers. On the eve of their departure for their divided labours, they had ceremoniously taken leave one of the other, and had not since met. The caravan continued its northward route, and the weather being favourable, during the next 10 days 2 fresh triangles were measured. The vast verdant wilderness was intersected by streams flowing between rows of the willow-like Ikarahout, from which the bokjesmen make their boughs. Large tracts of desert land occurred, where every trace of moisture disappeared, leaving the soil utterly bare but for the cropping up occasionally of those mucilaginous plants which no aridity can kill. For miles there was no natural object that could be used for a station, and consequently the astronomers were obliged to employ natural objects for their point of sight. This caused considerable loss of time, but was not attended with much real difficulty. The crew of the Queen and Char were employed in this part of the work, and performed their task well and rapidly, but the same jealousy that divided their chiefs crept in sometimes among the seamen. Zorn and Emery did all they could to neutralize any unpleasantness, but the discussion sometimes took a serious character. The Colonel and Strux continually interfered in behalf of their countrymen, whether they were right or wrong, but they only succeeded in making matters worse. After a while Zorn and Emery were the only members of the party who had preserved a perfect concord. Even Sir John Murray and Nicholas Palander, generally absorbed as they were, the one in his calculations, the other in his hunting, began to join the fray. One day the dispute went so far that Strux said to the Colonel, "You must please to moderate your tone with astronomers from Pulkowa. Remember it was their telescope that showed that the disk of Uranus is circular." "Yes," replied the Colonel, "but ours at Cambridge enabled us to classify the nebula of Andromeda." The irritation was evident, and at times seemed to imperil the fate of the triangulation. Hitherto the discussions had had no injurious effect, but perhaps rather served to keep every operation more scrupulously exact. On the 30th the weather suddenly changed. In any other region a storm and torrents of rain might have been expected. Angry-looking clouds covered the sky, and lightning, unaccompanied by thunder, gleamed through the mass of vapor. But condensation did not ensue, not a drop of rain fell onto the thirsty soil. The sky remained overcast for some days, and the fog rendered the points of sight invisible at the distance of a mile. The astronomers, however, would not lose time, and determined to set up lighted signals and work at night. The bushmen prudently advised caution, lest the electric light should attract the wild beasts too closely to their quarters, and in fact, during the night, the yelp of the jackal and the hoarse laugh of the hyena, like that of a drunken Negro, could plainly be heard. In the midst of this clamour, in which the roar of a lion could sometimes be distinguished, the astronomers felt rather distracted, and the measurements were taken at least less rapidly, if not less accurately. To take zenith distances while gleaming eyes might be gazing at them through the darkness, required imperturbable composure and the utmost sang-froid. But these qualities were not wanting in the members of the Commission, and after a few days they regained their presence of mind, and worked away in the midst of the beasts as calmly as if they were in their own observatories. Armed hunters attended them at every station, and no inconsiderable number of hyenas fell by their balls. Sir Johar thought this way of surveying delightful, and whilst his eye was at his telescope his hand was on his gun, and more than once he made a shot in the interval between two observations. Nothing occurred to check the steady progress of the survey, so that the astronomers hoped before the end of June to measure a second degree of the meridian. On the 17th they found that their path was crossed by an affluent of the Kuruman. The Europeans could easily take their instruments across in their indurubber canoe, but Mokoum would have to take the caravan to a ford which he remembered some miles below. The river was about half a mile wide, and its rapid current, broken here and there by rocks and stems of trees embedded in the mud, offered considerable danger to any light craft. Matthew Strux did not fail to represent this, but finding that his companions did not recoil from the attempt he gave way. Nicholas Palander alone was to accompany the caravan in its detour. He was too much absorbed in his calculations to give any thought to danger, but his presence was not indispensable to his companions, and the boat would only hold a limited number of passengers. Accordingly, he gave up his place to an Englishman of the crew of the Queen and Char, who would be more useful under the circumstances. After making an arrangement to meet to the north of the rapid, the caravan disappeared down the left bank of the stream, leaving Colonel Everest, Strux, Emery, Zorn, Sir John, 2 sailors, and a Bochjesman, who was the pioneer of the caravan and had been recommended by Mokoum as having much experience in African rapids. "A pretty river," observed Zorn to his friend, as the sailors were preparing the boat. "Very so, but hard to cross," answered Emery. "These rapids have not long to live, and therefore enjoy life. With a few weeks of this dry season there will hardly remain enough of this swollen torrent to water a caravan. It is soon exhausted, such is the law of nature, moral and physical. But we must not waste time in moralizing. See, the boat is equipped, and I am all anxiety to see her performances." In a few minutes the boat was launched beside a sloping bank of red granite. Here, sheltered by a projecting rock, the water quietly bathed the reeds and creepers. The instruments and provisions were put in the boat, and the passengers seated themselves so as not to interfere with the action of the oars. The Bochjesman took the helm. He spoke but a few words of English and advised the travellers to keep a profound silence while they were crossing. The boat soon felt the influence of the current. The sailors carefully obeyed every order of the Bochjesman. Sometimes they had to raise their oars to avoid some half-emerged stump. Sometimes to row hard across a whirlpool. When the current became too strong they could only guide the light boat as it drifted with the stream. The native, tiller in hand, sat watchful and motionless, prepared for every danger. The Europeans were half uneasy at their novel situation. They seemed carried away by an irresistible force. The colonel and Strux gazed at each other without a word. Sir John, with his rifle between his knees, watched the numerous birds that skimmed the water, and the 2 younger astronomers gazed with admiration at the banks, past which they flew with dizzy speed. The light boat soon reached the true rapid, which it was necessary to cross obliquely. At a word from the Bochjesman, the sailors put forth their strength, but, despite all their efforts, they were carried down parallel to the banks. The tiller and oars had no longer any effect, and the situation became really perilous. A rock or stump of a tree would inevitably have overturned the boat. In spite of the manifest peril, no one uttered a word. The Bochjesman half rose, and watched the direction which he could not control. 200 yards distant rose an islet of stones and trees, which it was impossible to avoid. In a few seconds the boat apparently must be lost, but the shock came with less violence than had seemed inevitable. The boat lurched and shipped a little water, but the passengers kept their places. They were astonished to observe that what they had presumed to be rock had moved, and was plunging about in the rush of the waters. It was an immense hippopotamus, 10 feet long, which had been carried by the current against the islet, and dared not venture out again into the rapid. Feeling the shock, he raised and shook his head, looking about him with his little dull eyes, and with his mouth wide open, showing his great canine teeth. He rushed furiously on the boat, which he threatened to bite to pieces. But Sir John Murray's presence of mind did not forsake him. Quietly shouldering his rifle, he fired at the animal near the ear. The hippopotamus did not quit his hold, but shook the boat as a dog would a hare. A second shot was soon lodged in his head. The blow was mortal. After pushing the boat with a last effort off the islet, the fleshy mass sank in the deep water. Before the dismayed voyagers could collect their thoughts, they were whirled obliquely into the rapid. 100 yards below, a sharp bend in the river broke the current. Thither was the boat carried, and was arrested by a violent shock. Safe and sound the whole party leapt to the bank. They were about 2 miles below the spot where they had embarked. Chapter 11. A missing companion. In continuing the survey, the astronomers had to be on their guard against the serpents that infested the region, venomous mambas, 10 to 12 feet long, whose bite would have been fatal. For days after the passage of the rapid, the observers found themselves in a wooded country. The trees, however, were not so high as to interfere with their labors, and at all points rose eminences which afforded excellent sites for the posts and electric lamps. The district, lying considerably lower than the rest of the plain, was moist and fertile. Emery noticed thousands of Hottentot fig trees, whose sour fruit is much relished by the Bockjesmen. From the ground arose a soft odor from the cucumacranti, a yellow fruit 2 or 3 inches long, growing from bulbous roots like the calchicum, and eagerly devoured by the native children. Here, too, in this more watered country, reappeared the fields of colocynths and borders of the mint so successfully naturalized in England. Notwithstanding its fertility, the country appeared little frequented by the wandering tribes, and not a kraal or a campfire was to be seen, yet water was abundant, forming some considerable streams and lagoons. The astronomers halted to await the caravan. The time fixed by Mokoum had just expired, and if he had reckoned well, he would join them today. The day, however, passed on, and no Bockjesmen appeared. Sir John conjectured that the hunter had probably been obliged to ford farther south than he had expected, since the river was unusually swollen. Another day passed and the caravan had not appeared. The colonel became uneasy, he could not go on, and the delay might affect the success of the operations. Matthew Struck said that it had always been his wish to accompany the caravan, and that if his advice had been followed they would not have found themselves in this predicament, but he would not admit that the responsibility rested on the Russians. Colonel Everest began to protest against these insinuations, but Sir John interposed, saying that what was done could not be undone, and that all the recriminations in the world would make no difference. It was then decided that if the caravan did not appear on the following day, Emery and Zorn, under the guidance of the Bockjesmen, should start to ascertain the reason of the delay. For the rest of the day the rivals kept apart, and Sir John passed his time in beating the surrounding woods. He failed in finding any game, but from a naturalist's point of view he ought to have been satisfied, since he brought down 2 fine specimens of African birds. One was a kind of partridge, a francolin, 13 inches long, with short legs, dark grey back, red beak and claws, and elegant wings, shaded with brown. The other bird, with a red throat and white tail, was a species of falcon. The Bockjesmen pioneer cleverly took off the skins, in order that they should be preserved entire. The next day was half over, and the 2 young men were just about to start on their search, when a distant bark arrested them. Soon Mokoum, on his zebra, emerged at full speed from the thicket of aloes on the left, and advanced towards the camp. "Welcome," cried Sir John joyfully, "we had almost given you up, and apart from you I should be inconsolable. I am only successful when you are with me. We will celebrate your return in a glass of usquebaugh." Mokoum made no answer, but anxiously scanned and counted the Europeans. Colonel Everest perceived his perplexity, and as he was dismounting, said, "For whom are you looking, Mokoum?" "For Mr. Palander," replied the bushman. "Is he not with you?" said the colonel. "Not now," answered Mokoum. "I thought I should find him with you." "He is lost." At these words, Matthew Struck stepped forward. "Lost," he cried. "He was confided to your care. You are responsible for his safety, and it is not enough to say he is lost." Mokoum's face flushed, and he answered impatiently, "Why should you expect me to take care of one who can't take care of himself? Why blame me? If Mr. Palander is lost, it is by his own folly. 20 times I have found him absorbed in his figures, and have brought him back to the caravan. But the evening before last he disappeared, and I have not seen him since. Perhaps if you are so clever, you can spy him out with your telescope." The bushman would doubtless have become more irritable still, if Sir John had not pacified him. Matthew Strux had not been able to get in a word, but now turned round unexpectedly to the colonel, saying, "I shall not abandon my countrymen. I suppose that if Sir John Murray or Mr. Emery were lost, you would suspend operations, and I don't see why you should do less for a Russian than for an Englishman." "Mr. Strux," cried the colonel, folding his arms, and fixing his eyes on his adversary, "do you wish to insult me? Why should you suppose that we will not seek this blundering calculator?" "Sir," said Strux. "Yes, blundering," repeated the colonel. "And to return to what you said, I maintain that any embarrassment to the progress of the operations from this circumstance would be due to the Russians alone." "Colonel," cried Strux, with gleaming eyes, "your words are hasty." "My words, on the contrary, are well weighed. Let it be understood that operations are suspended until Mr. Palander is found. Are you ready to start?" "I was ready before you spoke a word," answered Strux sharply. The caravan having now arrived, the disputants each went to his wagon. On the way Sir John could not help saying, "It is lucky that the stupid fellow has not carried off the double register." "Just what I was thinking," said the colonel. The Englishman proceeded more strictly to interrogate Mokoum. He told them that Palander had been missing for 2 days, and had last been seen alongside of the caravan about 12 miles from the encampment, that after missing him, he at once set out to seek for him, but being unsuccessful in all his search, had concluded that he must have made his way to his companions. Mokoum proposed that they should now explore the woods to the northeast, adding that they must not lose an hour if they wanted to find him alive, knowing that no one could wander with impunity for 2 days in a country infested like that with wild beasts. Where anyone else could find a subsistence, Palander, ever engrossed by his figures, would inevitably die of starvation. At 1 o'clock, guided by the hunter, they mounted and left the camp. The grotesque attitudes of Strux, as he clung uneasily to his steed, caused considerable diversion to his companions, who, however, were polite enough to pass no remark. Before leaving the camp, Mokoum asked the pioneer to lend him his keen-scented dog. The sagacious animal, after scenting a hat belonging to Palander, darted off in a northeasterly direction, whilst his master urged him on by a peculiar whistle. The little troop followed, and soon disappeared in the underwood. All the day the colonel and his companions followed the dog, who seemed instinctively to know what was required of him. They shouted, they fired their guns, but night came on when they had scoured the woods for 5 miles round, and they were at length obliged to rest until the following day. They spent the night in a grove, before which the bushmen had prudently kindled a wood fire. Some wild howls were heard, by no means reassuring. Hours passed in arguing about Palander, and discussing plans for his assistance. The English showed as much devotion as Strux could desire, and it was decided that all work should be adjourned till the Russian was found, alive or dead. After a weary night the day dawned. The horses were saddled, and the little troop again followed the dog. Towards the northeast they arrived at a district almost swampy in its character. The small watercourses increased in number, but they were easily forded, care being taken to avoid the crocodiles, of which Sir John, for the first time in his life, now saw some specimens. The bushmen would not permit that time should be wasted in any attack upon the reptiles, and restrained Sir John, who was always on the qui-vive to discharge a ball. Whenever a crocodile, snapping its prey with its formidable jaw, put its head out of water, the horses set off at a gallop to escape. The troop of riders went on over woods, plains, and marshes, noting the most insignificant tokens, here a broken bough, there a freshly trodden tuft of grass, or farther on some inexplicable mark, but no trace of Palander. When they had advanced 10 miles north of the last encampment, and were about to turn southeast, the dog suddenly gave signs of agitation. He barked, and in an excited way wagged his tail. Sniffing the dry grass, he ran on a few steps, and returned to the same spot. "The dog scent something," exclaimed the bushman. "It seems," said Sir John, "he is on a right track. Listen to his yelping, he seems to be talking to himself. He will be an invaluable creature if he scents out Palander." Strux did not quite relish the way in which his countryman was treated as a head of game, but the important thing now was to find him, and they all waited to follow the dog, as soon as he should be sure of the scent. Very soon the animal, with a loud yelp, bounded over the thicket and disappeared. The horses could not follow through the dense forest, but were obliged to take a circuitous path. The dog was certainly on the right track now, the only question was whether Palander was alive or dead. In a few minutes the yelping ceased, and the bushman and Sir John, who were in advance, were becoming uneasy, when suddenly the barking began again outside the forest, about half a mile away. The horses were spurred in that direction, and soon reached the confines of the marsh. The dog could distinctly be heard, but, on account of the lofty reeds, could not be seen. The riders dismounted, and tied their horses to a tree. With difficulty they made their way through the reeds and reached a large space covered with water and aquatic plants. In the lowest part lay the brown waters of a lagoon 1/2 mile square. The dog stopped at the muddy edge and barked furiously. "There he is!" cried Mokoum. And sure enough, on a stump at the extremity of a sort of peninsula sat Nicholas Palander, pencil in hand, and a notebook on his knees, wrapped in calculations. His friends could not suppress a cry. About 20 paces off a number of crocodiles, quite unknown to him, lay watching, and evidently designing an attack. "Make haste," said Mokoum, in a low voice. "I don't understand why these animals don't rush on him." "They are waiting till he is gamey," said Sir John, alluding to the idea common among the natives that these reptiles never touch fresh meat. The Bushman and Sir John, telling their companions to wait for them, passed round the lagoon and reached the narrow isthmus by which alone they could get near Palander. They had not gone 200 steps when the crocodiles, leaving the water, made straight towards their prey. Palander saw nothing, but went on writing. "Be quick and calm," whispered Mokoum, "or all is lost." Both, kneeling down, aimed at the nearest reptiles and fired. 2 monsters rolled into the water with broken backs, and the rest simultaneously disappeared beneath the surface. At the sound of the guns Palander raised his head. He recognized his companions and ran towards them waving his notebook, and like the philosopher of old exclaiming, "Eureka!" he cried, "I have found it." "What have you found?" asked Sir John. "An error in the last decimal of a logarithm of James Woolston's." It was a fact. The worthy man had discovered the error and had secured a right to the prize offered by Woolston's editor. For 4 days had the astronomer wandered in solitude. Truly Ampere, with his unrivaled gift of abstraction, could not have done better. Chapter 12. A station to Sir John's liking. So the Russian mathematician was found. When they asked him how he had passed those 4 days, he could not tell. He thought the whole story of the crocodiles was a joke and did not believe it. He had not been hungry. He had lived upon figures. Matthew Strux would not reproach his countryman before his colleagues, but there was every reason to believe that in private he gave him a severe reprimand. The geodetic operations were now resumed, and went on as usual till the 28th of June, when they had measured the base of the 15th triangle, which would conclude the 2nd and commence the 3rd degree of the meridian. Here a physical difficulty arose. The country was so thickly covered with underwood that although the artificial signals could be erected, they could not be discerned at any distance. One station was recognized as available for an electric lamp. This was a mountain 1,200 feet high, about 30 miles to the northwest. The choice of this would make the sides of this triangle considerably longer than any of the former, but it was at length determined to adopt it. Colonel Everest, Emery, Zorn, 3 sailors, and 2 Bockjesmen were appointed to establish the lighted signal, the distance being too great to work otherwise than at night. The little troop, accompanied by mules laden with the instruments and provisions, set off in the morning. The colonel did not expect to reach the base of the mountain till the following day, and however few might be the difficulties of the ascent, the observers in the camp would not see the lighted signal till the night of the 29th or 30th. In the interval of waiting, Strux and Palander went to their usual occupations, while Sir John and the Bushman shot antelopes. They found opportunity of hunting a giraffe, which is considered fine sport. Coming across a herd of 20, but so wild that they could not approach within 500 yards, they succeeded in detaching a female from the herd. The animal set off at first at a slow trot, allowing the horsemen to gain upon her, but when she found them near, she twisted her tail and started at full speed. The hunters followed for about 2 miles, when a ball from Sir John's rifle threw her onto her side and made her an easy victim. In the course of the next night the 2 Russians took some altitudes of the stars, which enabled them to determine the latitude of the encampment. The following night was clear and dry, without moon and stars, and the observers impatiently watched for the appearance of the electric light. Strux, Palander, and Sir John relieved guard at the telescope, but no light appeared. They concluded that the ascent of the mountain had offered serious difficulty, and again postponed their observations till the next night. Great, however, was their surprise when, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Colonel Everest and his companions suddenly reappeared in camp. In answer to inquiries whether he had found the mountain inaccessible, Colonel Everest replied that although in itself the mountain was entirely accessible, it was so guarded that they had found it necessary to come back for reinforcements. "Do you mean," said Sir John, "that the natives were assembled in force?" "Yes, natives with 4 paws and black manes, who have eaten up one of our horses." The colonel went on to say that the mountain was only to be approached by a spur on the southwest side. In the narrow defile leading to the spur a troop of lions had taken up their abode. These he had endeavored to dislodge, but, insufficiently armed, he was compelled to beat a retreat, after losing one of his horses by a single blow of a lion's paw. The recital kindled the interest of Sir John and the bushmen. Clearly it was a station worth conquering, and an expedition was at once arranged. All the Europeans, without exception, were eager to join, but it was necessary that some should remain at the camp to measure the angles at the base of the triangle. Therefore the colonel resolved to stay behind with Strux and Palander, while Sir John, Emery, and Zorn, to whose entreaties their chiefs had been obliged to yield, Mokoum, and 3 natives on whose courage he could rely, made up the party for the attack. They started at 4 in the afternoon, and by 9 were within 2 miles of the mountain. Here they dismounted, and made their arrangements for the night. No fire was kindled, Mokoum being unwilling to provoke a nocturnal attack from the animals, which he wished to meet by daylight. Throughout the night the roar of the lions could almost incessantly be heard. Not one of the hunters slept for so much as an hour, and Mokoum took advantage of their wakefulness to give them some advice from his own experience. "From what Colonel Everest tells us," he said calmly, "these are black-maned lions, the fiercest and most dangerous species of any. They leap for a distance of 16 to 20 paces, and I should advise you to avoid their first bound. Should the first fail, they rarely take a second. We will attack them as they re-enter their den at daybreak. They are always less fierce when they are well filled. But they will defend themselves well, for here, in this uninhabited district, they are unusually ferocious. Measure your distance well before you fire. Let the animal approach, and take a sure aim near the shoulder. We must leave our horses behind. The sight of a lion terrifies them, and therefore the safety of their rider is imperiled. We must fight on foot, and I rely on your calmness." All listened with silent attention. Mokoum was now the patient hunter. Although the lion seldom attacks a man without provocation, yet his fury, when once aroused, is terrible, and therefore the bushman enjoined composure on his companions, especially on Sir John, who was often carried away by his boldness. "Shoot at a lion," said Mokoum, as calmly as if you were shooting a partridge. At 4 o'clock, only a few red streaks being visible in the far east, the hunters tied up their horses securely and left their halting place. "Examine your guns, and be careful that your cartridges are in good trim," continued Mokoum, to those who carried rifles. For the 3 natives were armed otherwise, satisfied with their boughs of aloe, which already had rendered them good service. The party, in a compact group, turned towards the defile, which had been partially reconnoitered the evening before. They crept, like red Indians, silently between the trees, and soon reached the narrow gorge which formed the entrance. Here, winding between piles of granite, began the path leading to the first slopes of the spur. Midway the path had been widened by a landslip, and here was the cave tenanted by the lions. It was then arranged that Sir John, one of the natives, and Mokoum should creep along the upper edge of the defile, with the intention of driving out the animals to the lower extremity of the gorge. There the 2 young Europeans and the other 2 Bochjesmen should be in ambush to receive the fugitive beasts with shot and arrows. No spot could be better adapted for the maneuvers. The forked branches of a gigantic sycamore afforded a safe position, since lions do not climb, and the hunters, perched at a considerable height, could escape their bounds and aim at them under favorable conditions. William Emery objected to the plan as being dangerous for Sir John and the Bushmen, but the latter would hear of no modification, and Emery reluctantly acquiesced. Day now began to dawn, and the mountain top was glowing in the sun. Mokoum, after seeing his 4 companions installed in the sycamore, started off with Sir John and the Bochjesmen and soon mounted the devious path which lay on the right edge of the defile. Cautiously examining their path, they continued to advance. In the event of the lions having returned to their den and being at repose, it would be possible to make short work of them. After about a quarter of an hour the hunters, reaching the landslip before the cave to which Zorn had directed them, crouched down and examined the spot. It seemed a wide excavation, though at present they could hardly estimate the size. The entrance was marked by piles of bones and remains of animals, demonstrating, beyond doubt, that it was the lions' retreat. Contrary to the hunter's expectation, the cave seemed deserted. He crept to the entrance and satisfied himself that it was really empty. Calling his companions, who joined him immediately, he said, "Our game has not returned, Sir John, but it will not be long. I think we had better install ourselves in its place. Better to be besieged than besiegers, especially as we have an armed succor at hand. What do you think?" "I am at your orders, Mokoum," replied Sir John. All three accordingly entered. It was a deep grotto, strewn with bones and stained with blood. Repeating their scrutiny, lest they should be mistaken as to the cave being empty, they hastened to barricade the entrance by piling up stones, the intervening spaces being filled with boughs and dry brushwood. This only occupied a few minutes, the mouth of the cave being comparatively narrow. They then went behind their loopholes and awaited their prey, which was not long in coming. A lion and 2 lionesses approached within 100 yards of the cave. The lion, tossing his mane and sweeping the ground with his tail, carried in his teeth an entire antelope, which he shook with as much ease as a cat would a mouse. The 2 lionesses frisked along at his side. Sir John afterwards confessed that it was a moment of no little trepidation. He felt his pulses beat fast, and was conscious of something like fear, but he was soon himself again. His 2 companions retained their composure undisturbed. At the sight of the barricade, the beasts paused. They were within 60 paces. With a harsh roar from the lion, they all 3 rushed into a thicket on the right, a little below the spot where the hunters had first stopped. Their tawny backs and gleaming eyes were distinctly visible through the foliage. "The partridges are there," whispered Sir John. "Let us each take one." "No," answered Mokoum softly, "the brood is not all here, and the report of a gun would frighten the rest. Bokjesman, are you sure of your arrow at this distance?" "Yes, Mokoum," said the native. "Then aim at the male's left flank, and pierce his heart." The Bokjesman bent his bow, and the arrow whistled through the brushwood. With a loud roar, the lion made a bound and fell. He lay motionless, and his sharp teeth stood out in strong relief against his blood-stained lips. "Well done, Bokjesman," said Mokoum. At this moment the lionesses, leaving the thicket, flung themselves on the lion's body. Attracted by their roar, 2 other lions and a 3rd lioness appeared round the corner of the defile. Bristling with anger, they looked twice their ordinary size, and bounded forward with terrific roars. "Now for the rifles," cried the bushman, "we must shoot them on the wing, since they will not perch." The bushman took deliberate aim, and 1 lion fell, as it were paralyzed. The other, his paw broken by Sir John's bullet, rushed towards the barricade, followed by the infuriated lionesses. Unless the rifles could now be brought successfully to bear, the 3 animals would succeed in entering their den. The hunters retired. Their guns were quickly reloaded. 2 or 3 lucky shots, and all would be well, but an unforeseen circumstance occurred which rendered the hunters' situation to the last degree alarming. All at once a dense smoke filled the cave. One of the wads, falling on the dry brushwood, had set it alight, and soon a sheet of flames, fanned by the wind, lay between the men and the beasts. The lions recoiled, but the hunters would be suffocated if they remained where they were. It was a terrible moment, but they dared not hesitate. "Come out! Come out!" cried Mokoum. They pushed aside the brushwood with the butt ends of their guns, knocked down the stones, and, half-choked, leaped out of the cloud of smoke. The native and Sir John had hardly time to collect their senses when they were both knocked over. The African, struck on the chest by one of the lionesses, lay motionless on the ground. Sir John, who received a blow from the tail of the other, thought his leg was broken, and fell on his knees. But just as the animal turned upon him, a ball from the bushman arrested her, and, meeting a bone, exploded in her body. At this instant Zorn, Emery, and the 2 Bokjesmen appeared opportunely, although unsummoned, hastening up the defile. 2 lions and 1 lioness were dead, but 2 lionesses and the lion with the broken paw were still sufficiently formidable. The rifles, however, performed their duty. A second lioness fell, struck in both head and flank. The third lioness and the wounded lion bounded over the young men's heads, and amid a last salute of balls and arrows disappeared round the corner of the defile. Sir John uttered a loud hurrah. The lions were conquered, for carcasses measured the ground. With his friend's assistance, Sir John was soon on his feet again. His leg was not broken. The native soon recovered his consciousness, being merely stunned by the blow from the animal's head. An hour later, the little troop, without further trace of the fugitive couple, regained the thicket where they had left their horses. "Well," said Mokoum to Sir John, "I hope you like our African partridges." "Delightful." "Delightful," said Sir John, rubbing his leg, "but what tails they have, to be sure."